各位朋友，大家好。今天呢，明镜为大家直播美国国会的听证会，谈什么呢？谈美中之间贸易谈判的各项细节。美中贸易谈判呢，牵涉的不只是两国之间的经贸关系，可能也牵涉到中国会不会经济体制改变，同时也牵涉到了全球经济。所以传出一些好消息的时候，两国甚至其他国家的股市也因此上扬。当贸易谈判受阻的时候，大家都会担心会不会全球的经济又因此而陷入了低潮。那么现在看起来至少按照川普总统的讲法，似乎是有实质的进展，而且呢，他把原先所设定的3月2号要对来自中国的2500亿美元的商品要把关税从10%课征到25%，他现在讲说可以往后延了。那么这个都使得这个气氛似乎好一些。然而，这个美中之间的贸易谈判究竟有些什么具体的项目？国会要知道，国会有权知道，甚至可以讲国会应该知道。所以今天国会要开这个听证会，这个听证会已经开始了，我们呢为大家直播。现在这个是议员呢在提问啊。这个议员呢，他们这事前就准备了很多书面的一些问题，所以呢，这个联邦贸易代表莱特希泽他已经有一些书面的回答，但是在现场的问答这种1对1你来我往相互交锋，往往会蹦出非常这个精彩的火花。
Your leadership in the ongoing negotiations with China and for consulting with us today about where those negotiations stand and what comes next. We can all strongly agree that China has cheated on trade for decades, severely harming American workers and businesses. President Trump deserves significant credit for being the first president to confront China's unfair and predatory trade practices head-on and insist on a new, fair trading relationship with the U.S. While we want China to buy more U.S. goods that support farmers, manufacturers, and professionals here at home, it's even more important for us to hold China accountable to meeting high international standards on intellectual property rights, on subsidization, overcapacity, and the other structural ways in which China distorts the global economy. A new era of fair trade between China and the U.S. is in everyone's interest. The solution must be enforceable at every level of Chinese governance, measurable, and subject to corrective action should it fall short of commitments. And it should provide as much predictability as possible for our American job creators seeking to serve China's market. With a more level playing field and now armed with a competitive 21st century tax code, I'm confident that our farmers, workers, and local businesses can compete and win anywhere in the world. U.S. companies face a wide range of trade barriers from China, and I look forward to a thoughtful discussion of them today. China's unfair treatment of U.S. investors is a huge part of the problem that U.S. Trade Representative Section 301 report identifies in great detail. For example, China's equity caps and joint venture requirements prevent U.S. companies from controlling their own operations as well as their own intellectual property when they invest in China, giving Chinese competitors an unfair advantage and costing American jobs. A high standard, fully enforceable bilateral investment treaty with China can help us address many of these issues for the long term. And I'm hopeful the substantive talks underway, including in Washington last week, will produce meaningful commitments from China to lower trade barriers, achieve structural reforms, and establish a new era of fair trade. But no one country can take on China entirely alone. The three-party initiative, Mr. Ambassador, that you are undertaking with the European Union and Japan holds great promise that we must build on together. I'm also encouraged the Trump administration is showing leadership in aggressively challenging China when it violates WTO rules, including in its intellectual property licensing policies, as well as its subsidies and tariff rate quotas for our key ag commodities. Same time, I am concerned about the very real impact of tariffs on American manufacturers, consumers, and farmers. I'll continue to work closely with the President and his team to ensure we minimize impact to the United States and our allies as we take on China. Fairly traded goods that should be excluded from our tariff actions, that should products that are otherwise unavailable to U.S. companies, And I think having a real and workable exclusion process in place for any tariffs is essential so that we can focus these impacts on the bad behavior of China. In sum, thank you for being here, Ambassador. I look forward to today's discussion about the challenges we face in China and our demand for China to negotiate in good faith to achieve a durable and enforceable solution to the structural issues we face. Mr. Chairman, with that, I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Brady.
各位观众朋友，刚才这个提出质询的是这个 Kevin Brandy， 他是德州选出的众议员，这个非常资深的，做了20多年。他提出的几个观点呢，他是共和党的，所以他大体上是支持川普总统以强硬的态度来对待中国。那么这个 Brady 提到几个观点，我们的观众朋友应该也都是非常熟悉的，就是说这个中国盗窃美国的知识产权，那么中国是不公平的竞争。好，我们现在就这个男主角登场，就是莱特希泽，这联邦贸易代表。但是这个他最近呢，是要和中国的这个谈判的时候，他是美国这边的牵头人。川普总统特别指定他，而不是由商务部长来对中国进行这个贸易谈判。好，现在这个议员呢，请他这个离麦克风近一点，希望音量大一点。我们来听听看这个莱特希泽，这个究竟是怎么来讲他现在和中国之间的贸易谈判对话。我们来听听看。
Remind ourselves that with all our pressing problems, we have a very successful economy. Under President Trump's leadership, we are growing much faster than any G7 nation. We have created millions of new jobs, significantly to me, 500,000 manufacturing jobs. And we have seen 2 million people join the workforce. These are people who were not in it before. These are real working people moving from despair to hope, and their kids from insecurity to a future. A lot needs to be done, and I salute all members of both parties who are working so diligently on issues of worker training, opiate addiction, as well as trade and other issues. But we are here to talk about China. I agree with those who see our large and growing trade deficit and their unfair trade practices, including technology transfer issues, failure to protect intellectual property, large subsidies, cyber theft of commercial secrets, and other problems as major threats to our economy. We can compete with anyone in the world, but we must have rules, enforced rules, that make sure market outcomes, not state capitalism and technology theft, determine winners. President Trump has for years recognized this very serious, and I would say existential problem, and he is determined to take action to defend our workers, farmers, and ranchers, and our economic system. He directed me to conduct a study under Section 301. After months of hard work, the President ordered that certain tariffs be put in place. Because of his insight and grit, we are in a position to deal with this problem for the first time after decades of governmental inaction. I would like to note that as with many extremely important issues facing our country, prescience has been bipartisan. The Speaker was an early, forceful, and foresighted leader on this issue. I have admired her perception and hard work over the years and have counseled with her regularly in my current position. I would just like to read something briefly. Faced with the PNTR vote in April of 2000, the Speaker said, "It is incumbent upon all of us in the public and private sectors to work for free and open trade with China that is real. The U.S.-China bilateral WTO agreement, however, is seriously deficient in substance, implementation, and enforcement. This issue is too important for our economy to be based on a pattern of broken promises, not proven performance. China can become a member of the WTO without Congress having to surrender its right to U.S.-China trade review annually. There is no reason why we should permanently surrender that leverage at this time." I ask, if her position had prevailed, how different would things be right now? There are many other examples of bipartisan leadership, including a lot of people on this committee, and I'm going to get into them and answer the questions if it's relevant. Let me close by saying, that we have engaged in a very intense, extremely serious, and very specific negotiation with China on crucial structural issues for several months now. We are making real progress. If we can complete this effort, and again I say if, and can reach a satisfactory solution to the all-important outstanding issue of enforceability, as well as some other concerns, we might be able to have an agreement that helps us turn the corner in our economic relationship with China. Let me be clear, much still needs to be done, both before an agreement is reached and, more importantly, after it is reached, if one is reached. I want to thank all members for your bipartisan approach on this seminal effort, and I look forward to continuing our work together. I want to say that if this was not a bipartisan view, we would not be having the success that we're having. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ranking Member. I look forward to your questions.
各位观众朋友，刚才就是美国联邦贸易代表莱特希泽，也就是现在美中贸易谈判美国这边的首席谈判代表，他呢就大致上提到了美中之间贸易的状况。他说现在是在一个比较紧张的情况，因为呢，美国要求中国要履行承诺，履行在公元2002年。两个阶段，一个是公元2000年，中国取得美国所给予的永久正常贸易待遇，就是这个永久贸易最惠国这样的待遇。还有呢，就是2001-02年的时候，国会里边当时也多次的讨论，当时有不同的观点，就是美国是不是支持中国加入世界贸易组织 WTO。那么当时所做的各项承诺，美国要求中国要能够兑现。那么这个莱特希泽说，现在谈判有进展。但是呢，这个能不能够真正达成协议那么就是要看，这个中方能不能够有诚意来接受美国所提出的种种按照当初中国的承诺所做的要求。好了，现在这个议员呢已经跟这个莱特希泽进入了这种现场的询答，那么现在就是一问一答，这接下来可能会有更多的这个内容，更多的细节，我们来继续来收看收听。What we want is fair trade that requires structural change, and it has to be enforceable. We have had, and I can go through for the members, many, many examples of the Chinese agreeing to specific, not this specific, but agreeing to take steps to forego certain unfair trade practices, and in very few cases have they actually kept their obligations. We have to, in this case, approach this with the view that there are reformers in China who want to change these practices, and we're working together with them. That has to be our approach. And if that's the case, our hope is to have specific language on specific issues that is enforceable through a very clear process. 好，这个议员呢，刚才问这个我们现在和中国之间的主要的一些差别，或者美国所要求中国的有哪些项目？这个莱特希泽提了几点，第一个就是公平的贸易，第二个希望中国在结构上有些转变，再有一个就是这个中国的各项做法必须是真正的这个付诸实行的，而不只是口头承诺的。那么还有一个就是希望这个中国要能够取消这些这个非关税的壁垒，包含这个能够让美国的企业公平的进入到中国的这个市场。那么他说，这个美国现在要求的是中国过去在贸易上的很多做法，几十年下来的做法，美国希望中国改变。
This negotiation, if we're successful, there'll be a signing, and then there's going to be a long process of me working with the members of this committee and the Finance Committee and the Senate and other members to assure that we actually live up to this. And I believe other problems will arise, and they're going to have to be dealt with. I view this as a process, but this is I use the term turning the corner. This is the first time I believe that it's been approached in this way. And it's really the result of the creation of an enormous amount of leverage by the president.
Mr. Ambassador, As you reach an accord, will you envision
莱特希泽刚才提到说，这个美国现在应该是有一个两党共同的看法，要求中国做些改变。那么这也是头一次把中国给逼到墙角，这个要求中国必须做出一些改变要不然是美国是不会和中国签这一个贸易协议的。
Chairman knows well. I'm happy to talk to him about whatever's on my mind. I love it when you said there will have to be some discretion here. I wrote that down because I'm thinking that's like not my strongest suit, discretion. But I'm trying. I'm trying to do it. I will talk to you about that specifically. Certainly, it is an objective of the Chinese that tariffs go away. And I should just add a footnote that, in my judgment, does not mean anti-dumping, countervailing duty, the normal trade law. That's a separate process. That's a separate enforcement process. I'm dealing with Section 301 in this agreement.
Thank you. Let me recognize Mr. Brady.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I think you raise, both you and Ambassador Lighthizer raised an important part here, which is this is the first serious substantive attempt to change China's misbehavior. And it's not just one issue, that you are taking a comprehensive approach by challenging China at the World Trade Organization in cases, aligning with Europe and Japan on the WTO reforms that can address this, implementing the investment restrictions Congress put in place last year to address China, and then the 301 section case, the issue you're dealing with right now. It will take, this is the first comprehensive approach I've seen, and the one I think holds the most likelihood for success. I think as people look at what is a successful win for America, you ought to really focus, as you just mentioned, on the Section 301 area, where you really pulled back the curtain on China's trade practices and predatory trade practices and laid out that case. I know at home in Texas we have one of our best corporate citizens, Huntsman Corporation, nearly 1,000 employees in my district. They're an example of how American companies have no recourse when their intellectual property rights are violated in China because provincial Chinese courts simply don't uphold the rule of law. Not only did the court throw out this patent intellectual property case based on the expiration date of the die, they appointed a court panel to review the case that had an employee of the company that stole the intellectual property. It is that hard for businesses to compete. So let's talk about 301 a second. I think these are the key issues here. That'll define, I think, our success. You mentioned this earlier. Will the agreement that you're negotiating with China have measurable commitments in them? Will they be enforceable at all levels of China's governance? Because we know the play they've run before is to, pretend to protect intellectual property at the central government level, but not at the provincial or local court and communities levels. And finally, will there be an avenue for corrective action if China doesn't live up to its commitments in what we hope will be an agreement here in the near future? So measurable, enforceable at all levels of governance, and corrective action to make sure they live by those commitments.
这个议员呢 ，Brady 提了一个很尖锐的问题，就是说，这个不但是一个可以衡量的中国现在究竟做多少，而且美国是不是要责成中国所有各级政府，不能说是中方这个中央呢讲一套，下面呢就有这个另外一个调。这个现在是看这个莱特希泽怎么来回答这一方面。尤其是还提到的一个301，这个301什么呢？就是保护美国的知识产权。这其实一直是美中之间，或者是美国和很多国家之间的贸易纠纷时候的根源。
And that is my guide. I'm taking that and I'm distilling that down. And some of you it's one thing, some of you it's another, but it's all right in a band, right? And so that's what I am measuring myself by, and that's what I have as my objective. It's not just what I think; it's what everybody. I've distilled down what the people who have spent time thinking about this think. So the Huntsman example is like, unfortunately, one of many, many thousands.
Unfortunately.
And I could go on and on about that. I won't, because I only have 12 seconds or 10 seconds to go. So number one, yes, clearly it has to be specific, measurable. It has to be enforceable at all levels of government. Some things are not appropriate for that, but 99%, the core stuff is all. And in the agreement, it will say central, subcentral, local, and controlled agencies. So it's got to be across the board like that. And we have to have the ability to take proportional action unilaterally to make sure that we have a situation where they're following the contract.
Thank you, Ambassador.
Thank you, Mr. Brady.
是这个莱特希泽讲，他确实如此。他说不是我自己要求什么，不是我自己来衡量这个情势，而是在这个今天这个大厅里面，这是跨党派的要求中国所做的一些改变。所以他说是的，一个这个 measurable 是可以衡量的，一个 enforceable 就是要这个确实能够执行的。而且他说，不管是从中央然后再下来一个阶层，然后一直到各个地方上都必须要履行美国和中国之间的贸易协定，这样的一个协定才是美国愿意接受的。这个其实。在这个对于这个国会里边，现在也是两党共同的看法，都是要求说，中国所做的不管是什么样的承诺也好，让步也好，这个中国所做的必须是可以真正来实施的。甚至莱特希泽还提到的，就是这个要是一个可以有这个监察到的，就是这个要求中国方面呢，在有关于美中之间的这些贸易协定这个中国自己要能够有一套履行的机制，而如果说是在哪一个层级里没有确实履行的话，中国自己要采取什么样监督的机制，这个也是美国和中国在贸易谈判的时候对中国的要求。那么这是这个所以呢，现在是国会里面要求提出一些细节，但是这个大家也知道，谈判仍然在进行当中，而且进入到最后的关键期，所以呢，你要有很多的细节。还在这个讨价还价的时候把它曝了光，对于谈判的这一方呢，并不是一个有利的事情。但是呢，有很多原则性的事情，或者是说各个国会议员他来自他的选区，那么像这个刚才这个布莱迪他从德州选出来的，他那个地方就有很多这个高科技的业者，那么他们和中国交往的时候，最担心的事情之一就是这些机密被中国窃取，或者知识产权遭到中国给夺取。那么在这件事情上，这个美国刚才按照莱特希泽所讲的，这个美国是非常清楚的对中国是有所要求的。好了，现在这个接下来就是这个每个议员呢，然后来这个提他的问题。今天在国会里边呢，好几场听证会。这个另外呢，大家也知道，就是这个迈克尔·科恩这以前川普的前律师，那么这个现在也在国会里边，这个国会今天非常热闹。好，我们看看莱特希泽下一个问题怎么回答。
The principal reason why I'm spending my time doing this now is for the same reason that you just stated. That is to say, we have lost, not all just to China, but since China joined the WTO, we've lost 5 million manufacturing jobs and millions of additional jobs. And it would distress me if that was the result of economic forces. But it's not the result of economic forces. It's the result of state capitalism. So I am motivated by the same thing that you are, and I want to be judged by that, right? I want to ultimately be judged by that. On the aluminum question, you're completely right. We have a problem, a global problem in aluminum, precisely because China doesn't operate on an economic system. They have created through controlling their market access and subsidies and other practices, an extraordinary amount of excess capacity that has basically wiped out the aluminum industry across the world. The issues that we are focusing on in this negotiation are not, I mean, they are labor and environment to the extent those are unfair trade practices. But it's not the same as we are, as you know well, in USMCA, where those are specific objectives that we are requiring change in. So, to the extent there are unfair trade practices, I'd say also we are constrained by the limits of 301 and by the statute that we have to work with. But those are also, as you know well, high priorities for me.
好，这个议员呢，提到的就是这个现在啊，美中之间呢之外，美国还有和其他国家之间的贸易的争端。莱特希德讲的是，这个确实如此。美国现在是这个所谓的这个全球所面临的挑战，但是这个现在和中国之间的这个争议是最大的。为什么呢？一个是金额的问题因为大家知道中国的对美国是享有重大的顺差，另外一个是中国的做法的问题，这个所谓不公平的对于美国的这个就业机会造成很大的影响，美国的工业机会这个工作岗位有大量流失，所以这个现在是美国和中国之间的一个这个非常重要的这个纷争。所以呢，这个莱特希德又谈到了这个所谓的301，你可以感觉得到，今天前面好几个议员呢，对于这个知识产权是特别关切。事实上，在很长的时间，过去几十年，很多国家都和美国之间对于这个301有很大的争议。301是美国的法律，那么任何这个301条款呢，在任何国家和美国做生意都得遵守美国的法律，就好像美国人和中国做生意也得遵守中国人的法律。那么这个莱特希德就特别谈到这个301，他说这个也是现在美国在和中国这个贸易谈判的时候，美国所强烈要求的这个项目之一。好，我们再来听听看，今天我们导播非常辛苦，我们特别谢谢他们，把这个音量要调，这个画面要调配。我们来看看下面一位议员这个提问。
On a daily basis, stealing intellectual property from right here in the United States and transferring that to China to compete directly with our companies and our allies' companies around the globe. I'll give you an opportunity to expand on that.
Yeah, thank you very much, Congressman. Number one, I think that the U.S. has the best technology in the world. It's probably our single biggest competitive advantage, and why we'll be number one for a long time if we protect our intellectual property. Because it's not just a question of high-tech industries. It's steel. It's these combines. If you get into a modern combine, it's like a spaceship was in the '60s, right? These how they drive these things. They have all this computer operations and satellite operations. So technology is our biggest advantage, and it runs absolutely across every part of our economy. It is the key, and that's why the president had me focus on it right here. And I think China, as you suggest, knows full well that it's the key. Technology is what's going to determine who rules the future. Chinese practices are, you could break them down into twofold. One is what they do there, and the other is what they do here. We are negotiating provisions that will, if enforced, restate, make far more specific, and clarify commitments against cyber theft, against physical theft, and against using investment practices to get technology. What happens now, I don't want to go through a lot of specific examples, and I know you know far more of them than I do because this is part of your responsibility in the Intelligence Committee. But what happens very often is China comes in. For example, they invest in a company. The company develops technology. That technology ends up in China. And it could end up through investment. It could end up through cyber theft. It could end up through employees working for that company and then leaving and going to China. I mean, there's a whole group of things. And what we're trying to do is deal with that as much as we can in one agreement. And then that's one side of the problem. It's the one you're focusing on. The whole other side is how they get technology from us through non-economic means in China. U.S. companies operating there, and that's another thing that we're trying to deal with in this.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
好了，这个议员特别问到的就是有关于中国在这个科技方面遭到这个美国在科技方面遭到这个中国的侵袭。这个议员提到说，他这是一个天天都在发生的事情。美国的这个技术知识产权遭到中国的侵害。那么这个莱特希德谈到一个观点，他说美国在科技方面是在全世界居第一位，也正因为这个样子，所以美国的科技遭到人家窃取，也是全世界的这个第一位，要不然呢，你当然要偷，当然偷最好的了。所以呢，这个莱特希德提到几个观点，他说， 高科技决定未来，你就看过去几十年的人类社会发展就知道。那么美国怎么样不要让自己的高科技被别人偷去，而失去这样的领先的优势？所以呢，他说美国现在这个发现了几个问题，一个是这个所谓在网络上窃取美国的机密，一个呢是这个由这个工作人员这人来这个窃取美国的机密，比方说加入美国的公司，结果在美国窃密，这个美国的这个司法部门也破了好多这样的案子。还有一个呢就是这个说这个经济手段，就是一方面和中国做美国的这个公司和中国做生意，同时这个中国呢就从这些公司里面强迫你要这个提出交出来若干机密这几个都是美国现在在和中国贸易谈判时候这些重点。好了，我们这个请我们的导播继续，这个我们来看这个莱特希泽下面的回答。
I should take a step back and say, to the extent any agreement between nations is binding, right? I always have to make that clear. There's a great de Gaulle quote, which is that agreements between nations, I'll slightly change it to update it to the current situation, agreements between nations like flowers and children last while they last.
Right. And it's a binding trade agreement, a contract, as the President referred to it. And as a binding trade agreement, given the statutory authority that you and the President have to negotiate that's delegated by Congress, can you outline to us what you would anticipate after the agreement would be the timetable for submitting it to Congress for approval?
Thank you. We have no intentions of submitting it to Congress.
Well, if it's a trade agreement under Section 103, you're required to submit it to Congress, are you not?
It's an executive agreement. We're not required to submit it to Congress. We'll have to have this debate at some point. The President has... I'm sorry, Congressman.
As you've agreed with the President, it is a binding trade agreement that you're seeking. You can seek it only through delegation of congressional authority. And you're required to submit such agreements back if you're lowering U.S. tariffs, which would appear to be the case.
Well, let me just say that we are no way. This is a settlement of a 301 action. It's the President is using his power under Section 301, which has been delegated, and it's an executive agreement which the Constitution gives the President the right to enter into. We're not changing any tariff lines. We're not using TPA. And if we did, by the way, I wouldn't be here now anyway because we wouldn't have gone through the process. So this is not a TPP process. This is a settlement of a 301 action, and it's the President's constitutional authority to enter into executive agreements.
Since we may not agree on that, let me ask you if you do agree that unless you get meaningful structural changes to address the stealing of our intellectual property and the other issues that are out there structurally that you outline in your testimony, if all we get is the sale of a few more soybeans and other products, then this is an agreement not worth having, isn't it?
Yeah, I couldn't hear the last caveat.
I'm just saying the goal here is meaningful structural changes, and if we don't get them, this is an agreement not worth having.
I agree completely with that statement, and right now we're 500.
And let me just add how important it is, given, and I realize this is not in your direct jurisdiction, but I agree with my Texas Senator John Cornyn and the others who expressed concern about Huawei and its national security threat. And if there's any bargaining away of our national security to get this agreement, it would be with great harm to our country. Thank you.
So let me just say, one, I agree with you on 50% of the things. You get to the Hall of Fame if you do
progress.
Yeah, well, no, we're usually at 90%. But I do not think it should just be a purchase agreement. I agree with that completely. And the law enforcement provisions are outside of my purview. I have nothing to do with them.
Thank you. The chair would recognize Mr. Buchanan to inquire.
有一段非常重要的一个技术问题。这技术问题里边啊，两个，一个是华为，我们待会儿讲；另外一个呢，就是说这个美中之间的最后达成贸易协议要不要送到国会来批准？这个大家知道，如果是条约的话，那必须要经过美国国会批准。但是呢，这个协议啊，它究竟是跟条约那样具有这个的效力呢？这个还是说有其他的形式？那么莱特希则说，这是一个行政协定。也就是说，这是行政部门 宪法所赋予总统的权利和这个对方和中国达成的一个协定。这个协定呢，那就不需要再送到国会来审议了。为什么呢？他说，因为这个协定呢，它的基本的根据是301，就是说这个保护美国的知识产权、智慧财产权。那么这个当初这个301这个条款呢，是这个美国的整个的整个美国的这个贸易法规，它是经过国会同意的。那么国会呢，这个就授权行政部门去跟中国谈判，跟所有和美国做生意的国家谈判。那么所以呢，现在谈判达成的这个协议也是属于行政部门的协议，它就不需要再送到国会来批准了。这个是这个莱特希泽非常强调的一个观点。那么另外一个技术问题呢，就是华为。这议员就是问说这个华为这个事情呢，这个举世关注。那么在这个美国和中国这个贸易谈判的时候它会这个具有这个多大的分量？那么莱特希泽说，华为这个事情就孟晚舟这个事情能不能要引渡等等，这个事情现在是在司法程序。我跟中国谈的是有关于贸易的这个各样的协议，这两者贸易和司法在美国呢，它彼此不会这个相互混淆和这个相互干扰的。好了，我们现在来继续看这个美国联邦贸易代表莱特希泽在国会的这个听证会的答询。
Administration and then between 2010 to 2016, there were 10 different commitments where they agreed to do certain things, which commitments I would suggest were not lived up to, and therefore enforcement really is the biggest sort of thing. The president completely agrees with you on the issue of fentanyl. He specifically raised it with President Xi when we were in Buenos Aires at the dinner. President Xi, once again, I don't want to suggest that this is my area of expertise because it isn't, but agreed that he would treat it as whatever the equivalent of a controlled substance is in China. And this is something that the president views himself as having a commitment on. It may very well be something that we end up writing into this agreement, but it clearly is something the president views himself as having a commitment on, and that we are monitoring to see if there, in fact, are changes. Very important to the country for all the reasons that you said. I even made a veiled allusion to it in my opening statement. This idea of fighting opioids is as important as job training.
Let me add one other thing I just want to put on your radar. I know you've got a lot of things on your radar, but the ag community in Florida, forestry, a couple of years ago it did $8.4 billion. It's a big industry in our state. And in terms of exports to China, that's dried up for various reasons. We can talk about that at a later date. I just want to make sure that's something you're considering or looking at as well as part of the agreement.
No, I am. I actually have. I have a list of specific issues that have been raised by members that are appropriate for the agreement, and it's something that we have raised and will continue to raise.
Thank you, and I yield back.
We recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Thompson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for holding the hearing. Ambassador, thank you for being here. And thank you for your willingness to work with us and meet with us. You've been very open and very helpful during your time in this spot. I have 3 issues. You've heard from me on a couple of them before. I'd just like to reiterate those and raise one new one to you. And then let you respond accordingly. As you know, my district produces the finest wine in the world, and China is the largest and the fastest growing wine marketplace in the world. The 232 and 301 tariffs put a 39% tariff on our product, and we're having to compete with other New World wine areas, Australia and Chile, with 0 tariff. So I'd like some assurance that you're doing everything you can to ensure that high value-added specialty crop products have the enhanced entrance or enhanced access to the market. I know you're working on all agricultural issues and products. And then the other ag issue is rice. You know, milled rice in California has been waiting for the promised access to the Chinese market ever since China joined the WTO. And they've been very, very helpful, as you know, and very understanding. I guess I'd like to have some idea as to how much longer they're going to have to wait, or whether or not we're close to the promised access. And then the new issue that I want to raise today is the tariffs on building and construction materials. The national home builders suggest that these tariffs equal about $1 billion worth of tax on residential construction. And as you know, affordable housing, the lack of affordable housing is something that impacts all of our districts, every district in the country, and this just makes it harder to be able to build homes and get people into homes. And in my district in particular, we just went through a just terrific, horrific fire where we lost about 7,000 homes, and homeowners are trying to rebuild, and they've seen the cost of building materials coupled with the shortage of supply and the shortage of labor just drive the cost of replacement to a point where they can't rebuild the home that they lost in their fire. And then there's 7,000 homes in my district, and then the new fires up in the northern part of the state and in Congressman LaMalfa's area, and down in the southern part of the state, there's thousands more. And this is really a setback for homeowners who've already been through a lot. And so I'm just wondering, is that $1 billion tax really the best way to hold China accountable? And I concur that, you know, we need to hold them accountable, but is this the best way to do it at the expense of people who are trying to rebuild and move into their homes?
So thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, on the wine issue, and as you call them, high value added specialty crops, yes, they're very important. This negotiation, as we have all said, is about structural change and enforcement. But it is important that we have purchases, because the purchases will be good for specific people, and it'll also get the deficit down, which I think is an important thing to do directionally for sure. And in that context, we very much talk about high value added specialty crops, and wine, of course, is a great example of one. I mean, it is a product where the United States makes the best products in the world. So that I can attest to that personally. The second thing is rice is complicated. All right, first of all, we are talking about rice in the context of the purchases, number one. Number two, as you know, we have WTO cases, which we have. Is the second one public yet? No. Well, we have one that we've won and one that is in the process. It'll become public at some point. So trying to resolve those in the context of this agreement is something that we are trying to do. So that is something that we have raised. But as you know, rice is a funny issue in China. It has a different a political context than a lot of these other things we're talking about. But nonetheless, we're trying to do that. In terms of the $1 billion, I don't know the letter. I should look at it. I presume they're talking about softwood lumber, which I would say is a litigation matter, an AD/CVD matter, and I presume also steel and aluminum. I presume those are the things they're talking about. Yeah, I would assume that, and each of them has their own context. I would say softwood lumber is a litigation thing that we have to work our way through. Steel and aluminum, my objective, as many members know, is to try to work out something with Mexico and Canada on those things.
We've run out of time, but thank you. Any information you can get back to me.
All right, I'm sorry.
That. Thank you.
Now that we've established that California produces the best wine in the world, the chair would recognize the gentleman from Nebraska, Mr. Smith, to
加州选出的这一位也是资深的众议员啊，汤姆森问了几个非常非常实际的问题。那么这个莱特希泽一个一个回答得很细，就问几个问题。他从加州选出的汤姆森，他的选区啊是美国的酒的这个非常重要的产区，有葡萄啊，还有当地的天气啊、水源的这个水质等等。那么所以他就问到说。这个你们和中国谈的时候，这个能不能谈到说美国的酒啊，我的家乡的这个选区的葡萄酒卖更多卖到中国去？这个莱特希泽讲，他说呢，我们这次和中国谈是这个重点着重于希望中国的经贸结构有所改变，但是呢，这个我们也同样的把它这 这个美国的这个输出能够增加，也是我们和中国谈判的重点之一啊。他说这个是我们也谈到了有关于美国的农产品出口到中国的数量希望能够增加。还有这个我到这私底下可以跟你多讲一些。那么另外一个这个米的问题，这个他说这个加州是美国重要的米的产地嘛，他说这个你们觉得还要等多久，美国的米才能够这个出口到中国去？这个莱特希泽回答说，这是一个政治问题啊。这个中国自己是米的这个重要的这个产国，那么这个如果是中国的这个农业呢受到了这个重大的这种压力的话，对这个整个的经济形势或者政治形势啊都会有影响。所以呢，这莱特希泽说，这个能不能开放外国的米进口到这个自己的国家，这通常不是一个经济问题，不是一个单纯的经济问题，而是一个政治问题了。那么再有一个呢，就是这个议员就问到，他说我这个选区啊，去年呢这个大火，大家知道加州大火损失非常惨重，他这一个人的选区啊就有7000栋房子被烧掉了。那么现在要重建呢，这个就出现到一个是这个人工的问题，一个是材料价格的问题会因此而上涨。那么这个问到了有关于这个从这个中国进口的从中国来的这些这个建筑材料等等，这个莱特希泽呢说这个是牵涉比较多。那么就因为现在这个另外一方面就是美国它所需要的建筑材料也可以从加拿大从墨西哥进来，所以这个问题呢就没有这个讨论太多。好了，我们现在这个在国会听证会继续来听这个莱特希泽美国联邦贸易代表的回答。
Most members would have at least some interest from biotechnology to specific issues involving beef, poultry, aquatics, meats. I mean, there's just, I could go through it all, a lot on rice. I mean, beyond the purchase, a lot on just the SPS issues. So we spent a lot of time on there. We actually had long discussions on ractopamine, for those of you who are from the beef producing areas, with the vice premier of China. So it was pretty detailed discussion. So having said that, to sort of jump ahead, I want to go to Japan very soon. The date's probably going to be in the next month. I want to have a trilateral meeting there on this issue of China with these, and I also want to start our negotiations, which we've now, remember, we've gone through the process of TPA with everyone, with the Congress, and now we're beyond our 90 days, so we can start the actual negotiating. We feel a certain urgency, a real urgency, because of the combination of market access from TPP in Europe in this sort of thing you alluded to, and it's going to have a real effect on our farmers. So it's something that we feel very strongly about. On Canada and Mexico, in the context of maintaining the integrity of the steel and aluminum program, we want very much to work out an agreement with Canada and Mexico, and we're in the process of doing that. Whether we'll succeed or not, I don't know, but it certainly is my hope that we'll do that.
Thank you. I yield back.
议员刚刚问到的是有关于这个美国牛肉出口的问题。那么莱特希泽回答就是说，这个美国牛肉啊，这个某些国家的有疑虑的原因呢，就在于这个瘦肉精。这瘦肉精它的这个存量到底是在一个什么样的标准？各国呢还有各自不同的看法。那么他说，这个下个月他要去日本谈这个有关于美国的这些这个肉类出口的问题。那么也许这个在这议员所问的时候，这不只是说这个美国和中国的贸易问题，而也谈到的就是美国本身的产品出口的问题。大家知道，所有的这个政治啊，最后都落实在地方上，选民呢，这个是根据自己的利益来决定是不是投你一票。所以议员的这个票仓啊，是来自于对于选民的承诺。好了，我们继续来看莱特希泽回答下一个问题。
What we are doing and what we have to remind ourselves in this context is settling a 301 case. So how I would define success, and once again, I'll try to repeat what I said before, I really went through and tried to distill what everyone else, members, business groups, farm groups, but also experts, people who actually study these things. And for me, success is number one, enforceable. Number two, real rules on forced technology transfer at every level of government, as Mr. Brady said, which is absolutely essential. Minimum intellectual property requirements. And once again, this section is probably going to be, if we have an agreement, the IP section alone will be about 27 or 28 pages. It's going to be, this is long, detailed, but every one of you would say, oh yes, that's what I would expect normal IP protection to be, right? In other words, I'm not inventing anything at all. We have a series of items involving services. There are specific provisions that China has that keep us out of banking, out of electronic payment, out of a whole variety of things like that. And we, on many of those, we've made substantial progress, and I would consider that to be another chapter. I would say will be non-tariff barriers, and this is literally how we negotiated this thing. Non-tariff barriers. What's a big non-tariff barrier? That is these subsidies, these industrial subsidies that have the effect. Which have the effect of making it possible for our people not only to compete in many cases in China, but to compete around the world. So that's another thing. There's a whole lot of things that we expect to gather on agriculture, and I kind of went through it on that, and we have made progress on a number of those. One thing that we haven't mentioned is we are negotiating currency restraints. A lot of members are very concerned about currency manipulation and having access to the information that allows you to make a combination. So that is another part of these negotiations. And to be honest, there actually are more, and I could make it even more detailed. But to me, that's how I am going to determine whether or not this is a trade agreement. Now, keep in mind, it's not like an FTA in the sense that we're going in there and going across the board. What we're going in there is focusing on what was raised by, for the most part, what was raised by our 301. And if we do all of those things, and the speaker said this, and it's not enforceable, and she said it in the context of USMCA, and it's not enforceable, then it's not very valuable. So we have to have it be enforceable, and that I think it will be for the first time. I think we will have an enforceable agreement.
好的，莱特希泽刚才这段话讲说，这一次和美国、中美之间的贸易谈判，美国要求的第一个原则，最重要的是什么呢？就是能够真正能够履行、能够兑现的。这个是美国总结过去几十年和中国的贸易谈判和中国的贸易实务交手之后得到的经验。所以第一个最重要的原则就是签的这个协议是可以有效履行的，这个是美国的原则。然后呢，他说这个重点之一是有关于保护知识产权，保护美国的科技。他说在这一个方面呢，他说美国这边准备的材料有好几十页，好像27页之多，一条一条列出来，要中国能够确实遵守协议，保护美国既有的知识产权。那么这个另外呢，还谈到就是这一次美国这个很严肃的要谈到有关于这个中国的贸易补贴问题就是这个就是美国不是提当时所谓的是30嘛，就是零关税、零壁垒跟零补贴嘛。那么还有呢，就是要谈到美国的这个金融产业能不能够这个公平的进入到中国的市场。那么还谈到就是这个有关于这个汇率操纵的问题。大家知道，这一直在美国不时就会传出来说，是不是要把中国定为货币这个操控国？那么因为呢，用这个人为的方式使得你的币值偏低，来促进你的经济出口，这个对美国来讲呢是这个非常在意的事情。这几个都是这一次在谈的。这个。所以这本来议员就是希望能够多一点的细节，就是从这个一问一答中间呢问出来更多。你现在跟中国在谈的时候你的这个优先顺序是什么？你的这个条列的项目是什么？你这个最大的关切是什么？现在就听这个莱特希泽继续回答。这个朋友们如果晚一点加入我们的话，这是这个议员一问，然后这个莱特希泽一答，一问一答。然后呢，这个进行的时间就很难说到底要多久。总是要让这个议员呢充分了解美国行政部门现在的原则、现在的做法、现在面对的困难。因为呢，这个不管说你这个协议是什么样的形式，最终是不是要经过国会来这个表决，有的要，有的不需要。但是这个国会它基本上它是一个是监督的。还有一个是咨商的，所以今天呢，莱特希泽一开始就提到了说，当然这也是一个这个在美国当初宪法设计的时候，就国会对于行政部门呢也是有这个咨商的这么样一个这个机制的。好，我们继续来听 特海泽莱特希泽的回答。
The members have. It's the biggest thing I've ever seen. So, and I appreciate very much the governor's support and hopefully your support for USMCA. If USMCA doesn't pass, I've said this before, it would be a catastrophe across the country, but it would particularly be a catastrophe in Texas. It's just, I mean, it's just, it would be very bad on every level, way beyond economics, right? I mean, you know what I'm talking about, and I won't dwell on that, but I'm very appreciative of and the president's very appreciative of the governors. So when I look at this, and this is not just your district, I don't know if you have, you must have a big district if it's got that airport in it, but if you have any agricultural products, there will be a substantial increase in those and a substantial reduction in barriers. But I would say when I talk to members generally, the most important single thing that we're going to do is stop the non-economic transfer of technology. That technology really is what separates us from the rest of the world. And it is for me, and I think this is true in most, it is for me what's going to ensure that our kids have the kind of jobs that we had and better jobs that we want them to have. If we end up losing that technological edge where we are number 2 in technology, then the world's going to look very different for our children. And that literally is what I think is happening. I could talk about the various specific provisions, but if we make headway to stop this transfer of technology and this unfair trade by this trading partner, it's going to have a huge impact in terms of jobs and high-end jobs in America.
Thank you for the work you're doing, Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the Trade Subcommittee Chairman, Mr. Blumenauer.
莱特希泽提到几个重点啊。一个是议员问到了美加墨，就是等于是一个新的这个北美自由贸易协定。他说这个协定呢是花了很大的功夫，是保护美国的利益，那么是一个长远的、稳健的、可行的这个自由贸易协定。那么这个协定呢要送到国会来批准的。如果他说国会否决的话，他说这是一个灾难性的结果这是一件事。另外一个呢就是说他这一次有关于美中之间的贸易谈判，他说如果你要举一件最重要的事情，我只讲一件的话，这是哪一件呢？就是美国如何确保自己的科技优势不要被中国给偷走。他说呢这个什么事情让美国和其他的国家不一样呢？有一个很重要的就是美国所掌握的科技优势。美国现在在科技优势上是世界第一，这个呢不但是确保美国的经济优势，也确保美国下一代的就业机会。但是你想想，如果今天美国所掌握的科技优势不是世界第一，而是世界第2的话，那整个的情况就不一样了。这个不仅是牵涉到美国，甚至牵涉到其他的国家。那么这个是美国现在和中国贸易谈判的时候，如果你要单举一件事情，什么是最重要？那就是确保美国的科技不要遭到中国的窃取。但是这也是为什么现在美国和中国贸易谈判的时候，要花很多时间，要花很多精力，因为美国有非常坚持的这个原则，就是有关于像是知识产权。这个中国不能够再来这样的窃取，有关于这个美国所掌握的科技，那么中国不能够再来窃取，这个都是刚才莱特希泽特别提出来。这个如果你要单讲一件事情，美国这一次和中国的贸易谈判，美国最在意的是什么？就是有关于这个既有的科技优势。好了，这个我们继续来听这个议员的这个质询呢和莱特希泽的回答。谢谢我们的导播。
You've even called for the United States to change our trade remedy laws and bring a WTO case against it. I have 4 questions. It's been claimed that there is already a deal reached on currency. Is that true? If so, can you tell us anything about the substance of that agreement? In the past, I've made a point in my support for trade agreements that we need to have our trading partners commit to stronger worker protections, environmental standards, currency disciplines, and that the commitments to be meaningful. Are you seeking enforceable currency commitments from China? And last but not least, if you see indications that China is manipulating, what will the United States to do? Does enforcement mean more across-the-board tariffs?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. So I would say, as you say, currency problems is something that I've spent a fair amount of my time, not necessarily in my current job, but in previous jobs, worrying about. And I would also say that it's not just a problem with China. It's a problem with a lot of other areas in Asia, and a reasonable case can be made that it has at times been a serious problem with Japan. And I know those of you who are in the automobile industry realize that. It was a substantial problem, and we lost a lot of jobs because of that. But also some other areas. I don't want to name any other countries, but it has been a problem from time to time. So it's something we have to focus on. There are costs in being the reserve currency, but one of them can't be that we lose, the good people who go to work every day and have a competitive job lose their job. So it's something we have to focus on. In here, is there agreement? There's no agreement on anything until there's agreement on everything. You know that from how these things work. But the reality is that we have spent a lot of time on currency, and it'll be enforceable. The agreement will be enforceable, and I think there'll be something on it. But I'll talk to you offline.
Yeah, I would appreciate that.
Chair would recognize the gentlelady from Indiana, Ms. Wolarski, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here today. Mr. Chairman, I ask permission to insert into the record a letter signed by over 150 trade associations asking for a Federal Register notice that formally delays the increase of the List 3 tariffs from 10% to 25%.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, great to see you again. Always glad to have you here. When can we expect that Federal Register notice?
So the Federal, that Federal Register notice is being worked on right now. The President's made the decision, and it's sort of in process. In the next day or so, the President has made that decision. He's made the announcement, and we're following the legal process. We have a process where we go through. We have a TPSC process, as you know, we deal with other agencies, and there are certain steps we have to go to. But that is something that will happen, and it'll happen according to the normal course.
And with that, when do you anticipate releasing more decisions for exclusion requests from List 1 or 2 of the 301 tariffs?
So we're in the process of doing that right now. And those were, in the first place, we've already granted more than 1,000 or almost 1,000, as you know. And things were sort of slowed down because of the government closure, but we're in the process of doing that right now. We expect another sort of tranche to come out fairly soon.
Mr. Chairman, I ask permission to insert into the record a letter myself and my friend Mr. Kine led that was signed by 167 of our colleagues asking for an exclusion process for List 3 of the 301 tariffs. Mr. Chairman.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Ambassador, there's obviously great support in Congress for an exclusion process for List 3, and we've chatted about it, and I appreciate that. In fact, the most recent spending bill instructed USTR to establish a process within 30 days. We're almost halfway to that deadline. Do you expect to meet that 30-day deadline? Oh, Mr. Chairman, I can't hear you.
Can you get that microphone,
Thank you.
Mr. Ambassador?
Thank you.
I would say, first of all, that was a report from the Appropriations Committee. I understand that there are people in Congress who want us to have an exclusion process. It's something that we're looking at. Our view till now has been that we would have an exclusion process for the $50 billion, which was at 25%, the 10%, which is what you're referring to in this case, that there would not be an exclusion process. I would note that since the date that we put that into place, there's been a 7 or an 8, depending on when you stop, devaluation of the Chinese currency. So the effect has been less significant than fully 10% on those people are affected. And our hope is that we can deal with this in the context of our negotiations with the Chinese. I'm sorry.
I'm sorry to interrupt. I also appreciate, I know you and I chatted, the constraints on resources, and I understand that you're facing with this exclusion process. I recognize that the process for lists 1 and 2 is tough to administer, and I know it's moving slowly, and that list 3 is kind of looming out there at 4 times the size, and I understand that as well. But can I just ask you this, and to close here, is there a way to simplify things a little to take the load off of your agency? For instance, what about companies who are hurt because their only competitors are foreign and are able to export finished products to the U.S. at little or no tariffs?
Well, we have a process right now that we're following that we think is fair, and it looks at the competitive effect, whether products are available in other areas, and whether or not it's the focus of China 2025. So we're happy with our current process, but it's as you say, it's a big process.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. I yield back.
Thank you, gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Wisconsin.
谈了一些这个技术性的问题，那么也谈了实质的问题。这个技术性问题之一啊，就是说议员呢问说，什么时候你会把它登载在联邦公报上？美国这个联邦公报就是政府和其他国家的这个协议啊，一些这个重要的事情呢，你都必须要公告周知，让这个人民呢全盘了解。所以这个他就问你什么时候会公告？这个问题啊，这个不太常出现，因为呢，反正早晚有公告，有人不在乎早一天晚一天。但是这个莱特希泽讲，他就是总统签字啊，这个程序走完了，也许我们第2天就会公告了。这本来也就是要满足人民知的权利。一个实质问题是有关于汇率的问题。这个大家刚前面也有别的议员问到了。那么莱特希泽提到说，这个有关于汇率的问题，那不只是美国和中国的问题，这个在这个亚太很多国家，美国都和他们的谈过，或者是这个正在谈这些议题。像日本也是有一个这样的问题，因为呢，这个汇率啊是决定你的出口产品的价格最重要的原因。那么这个之一了，至少是之一。那么所以呢，他说美国不只是和中国这个要关注中国的这个有没有人为操控汇率，对其他的国家，这个美国也是如此的。然后呢，他说这个有关于汇率这个问题啊是非常敏感的。我可以告诉你是美国花了很多功夫啊，来谈这个议题。但有些事情呢，那我就私底下来跟你谈的，因为这个通常这种公听会啊之外。就是你可以跟议员呢有这个闭门的这些会谈，有些事情暂时不便公开的，在这种闭门的会议当中告诉议员，让议员知道。好了，我们现在继续看这个现场的议员的这个质询来自己的回答。
Would have isolated them and put great pressure on them, whether it was prohibition on IP theft, on forced technology transfers, on joint ventures, strong labor and environmental chapters, fully enforceable, e-commerce and digital trade chapter, everything that we're trying to accomplish right now to elevate standards to where we are. A prohibition against localization rules, for instance, was contained in the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Moving forward on that would have put, I think, incredible leverage on China, isolating them in the region, and now we're on the outside looking in. And China's being able to help establish those rules of trade. At some point, we hope to be able to find a way to get back in that agreement rather than disadvantaging us from that. But having said that, let me go back to the original questions I asked in regards to the level of cooperation and coordination with other nations right now in regards to China. There's strength in numbers. And I think ultimately China will respond to the collective will of the international community much better than the unilateral action that we're taking against them today. And then finally, the lost market access issue.
So, thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, I think getting out of TPP was the right decision. It was a bad agreement. It was poorly negotiated. And a car could have been manufactured 45% in Vietnam and 55% in China and sold in the United States duty-free. It didn't do much on currency. It had a whole lot of problems. And in any event, to get to your geopolitical problem, had China joined it, they wouldn't have lived up to the rules. We would have had a problem. Number one. Number two, as you know well, we have FTAs with 6 of the 11 countries that are in it already, and of the other 5, 95% of the GDP is in Japan, where, with your support and help, we're negotiating. So now I've said my thing, but I said it like this period of time. In terms of cooperation, we are trying to do it on 2 tracks. We do want to cooperate with other countries. As I say, we have the trilateral thing. We're trying your approach. I would say, though, that your approach by itself it was less likely to be successful, and indeed was tried by prior administrations unsuccessfully. So what we want to do is continue that approach, but also put in place the unilateral action that the President has taken. And I would note that that unilateral action is what has brought us to the point where we are now. We're on, hopefully on the verge of beginning to turn the corner. In terms of...
the gentleman will finish.
Well, in terms of trade with China, we hope that we can get these barriers down, and we can do this before we lose our supply chains and our customers.
Okay. Thank you. Let me recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Dr. Winstrup, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Ambassador, for being here with us today. Question a little off track from China, but does relate to China. My colleague, Terry Sewell, and I have introduced the legislation to extend the Caribbean Basin Trade Partnership Act for another 10 years from 2020 to 2030. It's an important program to U.S. textile industry because it requires the use of U.S.-made yarns. And for a country like Haiti, this act allows their garment industry a fighting chance to compete with large Asian suppliers such as China and Vietnam. And with the program set to expire and people trying to make investment decisions and production plans, certainty is important to U.S. companies, but especially when doing business in a least developed country like Haiti. Do you foresee support for a reauthorization of this act?
I'm not prepared to say. I haven't studied it. I don't have an idea. The fact that you and Congresswoman Sewell are in favor of it certainly is a very positive indicator from my point of view. But I want to look at it, and I would also say that generally the requirements of U.S.-made yarn in textiles going forward is something that I have supported as a matter of policy in a variety of other areas. But I want to look at that so I can give you an informed opinion.
So it hasn't come up in any talks with China and how it might affect them. So
pardon me?
It hasn't come up in any conversations with China as how it might affect them, that they have a concern about it.
No, that specifically it has not.
One other question when it comes to China's retaliation, if you will, and some of the effects on agriculture and their access to markets. You talk about some of the non-tariff barriers, and one of the things that's come to attention is inspection requirements that aren't scientific based. Can you elaborate on some of the things that they're doing in that arena, if you will?
I'd be happy to do that, Congressman. This is something that we spent an awful lot of time on. There's a whole lot of, as you know, technical barriers to trade or non-tariff barriers to trade, depending on what term you want to use. One of them that we spent probably the most single time on, this whole issue of biotechnology and their approval processes. In the U.S., it's 18 to 24 months to get an approval. In China, there are ones that are 7 and 8 years and haven't had approval. It's a very complicated process, and it is one that has a very, very negative effect on the United States because in many cases U.S. farmers will not introduce the technology themselves in the U.S. until it's approved in their major markets, one of which is China. So we spent a lot of time on that. Hopefully we made some headway. The time was both to change things systemically and to put in time limits and the like. Whether we succeed on that, we'll see. I don't want to suggest that we will, but we did raise it and talk about it a great deal, that there be science-based decision-making, because right now there's not science-based decision-making in many, many cases. That there be time, and we have a long pipeline of things that have been stacked up for years and years and years and years and years. So we understand how important this is. They're changing their process and getting it really more in line with the international norms is something we spend a lot of time about, and have it be science-based. So we'll see where that turns out. I don't want to suggest that those talks are over. We spent a lot of time on it, though, and we realize how important it is.
Yeah, thank you very much. I appreciate that.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize the gentleman from New Jersey to inquire, Mr. Pasquale.
一个是有关于这个中国对海地还有这个拉美啊，这个议员这个莱特希泽他对这方面呢这个没有特别注意，因为这个是现在他所着重的是美国和中国之间的一些贸易关系。那么议员还问到一件事情，就是有关于这个这种这个 药品研发的事情。这个莱特希泽花了一些时间，他是因为在美国啊，这个药品从研发到上市，这中间要经过很长的时间，有的经过好多年。那么10几年都有可能，因为这个一旦是这个上市，这必须是它一个使用的很安全的、有成效的，副作用能够是可以预见的等等。所以美国在这个管制方面呢是极其严格的。那么这个在中国方面的做法是不是这样子呢？这是有差距的。所以呢，他说在这个美中贸易谈判在这方面也花了很多时间，就是这个有关于这种生物科技的。这种研发，这里面当然也牵涉到的方方面面的，比方说这种，这个你要投下多少时间，要投下多少人力，投下多少钱，还有这个呢，也是双方在这个贸易的这些争执中间的一个项目。这个莱特希泽并没有具体的说明到底这些明显的差距在哪里，不过很显然的。双方长久以来对很多议题的看法，是有很多根深蒂固的因素，是有很多这个多年来没有办法这个完全的相互理解，或者说是这个共同所遵守的这些事项的，这是这个美中贸易谈判的常常出现很多障碍，也非常重要的原因。好了，这个庭宪议员又讲到了这个汇率的问题，我们来继续来听。
I'm not very good at that. But none of us are. I would say, first of all, I think without question, the president has been imaginative, right? The whole 301 approach we've used has been something that people haven't used before, and it's had a huge difference. So I feel very comfortable that I've passed my own standard of imaginative. And I might say, in the case of the president, gritty, right? He had the grit to get this done. In terms of currency, it is certainly our objective, and once again, these provisions are never agreed to, everything's agreed to, that there be commitments not to do competitive devaluations. As Congressman, I think it was Thompson said, it's complicated what's happened in the last couple of years, where we are on that, and I could argue that round, or I could argue it square. Those kind of decisions on currency manipulation are not made by me. Of course, they're made by the Secretary of Treasury. But they're complicated issues. But without question, in the past, China has used currency manipulation, and our desire is that there be commitments like that, as well as commitments to a certain amount of transparency.
I hope for another meeting, Ambassador, we will talk about the relationship between your job and the Treasurer's job in terms of trade. And where exactly does the Congress fit in? Do you think labor or environmental issues are in the scope of the 301 negotiations?
I would say to the extent that they are involved in these unfair trade practices, they are. But this is not like a free trade agreement where we're going across the board and looking at a whole variety of very important issues. So my scope is narrower here because it's based on 301. And by the way, I would love to work with you and other members who want to sit back and figure out a way that we can create new statutory authority that allows me to use something like 301 in these areas. I would love to sit down and talk to you.
Mr. Chairman, can I just add one sentence?
Please.
If your answer, if not, to my question, I'd point out the agricultural market access is not in the scope of the 301 report, but you are negotiating these anyway. And so, you know, consistency, I'm not really, that's not the essence of my question, my point, which my time is up. But I wanted you to take a look at that because it's caused some confusion, and I would like some clarity on it. If at all possible, call me, write me, whatever you can. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Kansas, Mr. Estes, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for joining us today. You know, as the representative from the air capital of the world and the breadbasket of America, trade's a critical issue for my district and for the state of Kansas. In fact, according to the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, trade supports over 108,000 jobs for these exports, and the value over $17 billion for the economy in our state. Before I focus on trade relationships with China, I want to first thank you for your work on upgrading NAFTA and replacing it with the U.S.-Mexico-Canada Free Trade Agreement. You know, Canada and Mexico are Kansas' top export markets, worth about $3.5 billion. And since its adoption, NAFTA has been really beneficial for my district, particularly the farmers, ranchers, and aerospace manufacturers. But the 20-year-old agreement did need some upgrading and some reform efforts, and I'm thankful for that they've done that, and hopefully that we can get through this process and get that ratified quickly so that we can move forward with some of the other important issues that you're doing. So let's go back today and focus, as we want to, on China. You know, tariff retaliation from China has threatened Kansas exports worth about $525 million to China, led by a lot of grain products, soybeans, sorghum, cotton, beef, as well as aircraft manufacturing and other manufacturing. As a big supporter of free and fair trade, I believe a prolonged trade war with these tariffs is not the final outcome that any of us want. You know, as I've talked to Kansas farmers and manufacturers in the district, I've heard over and over again how they support the president and believe we can get a better trade deal negotiating through strength. One of the things I think our colleagues on both sides of the aisle would agree that China has been harming American businesses and workers for decades. In fact, we've seen so much cheating over the years that it's having a drastic impact. You know, for example, in 2013, a Chinese national was arrested in Kansas for attempting to steal some intellectual property regarding research pertaining to rice seeds and to send that to scientists in China. So I'm proud that President Trump's been one of the first presidents to stand up to these unfair trade practices and hope to bring China to the table in a meaningful way to help make sure we have free and fair trade agreements. Since we've entered these negotiations with China, there's been a lot of positive steps, and we want to make sure that we continue moving forward with some of those positive activities. I don't want to stop there. You know, as I mentioned earlier, that China has threatened exports from Kansas worth $525 million. And one of the things we want to make sure that, you know, as I talk with constituents, that particularly with both in the farming community as well as aerospace, and hopefully that we can work on making sure that the retaliatory and regulatory practices are fixed. And so I just want to talk a little bit about what you're seeing in that regards on your negotiation of correcting those unfair practices.
Well, you know, thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you specifically for your support on USMCA. As you know, that's our top priority, and if the Congress doesn't see fit to pass that, then everything else we're talking about is kind of like a footnote, because it'll mean we can't do trade deals and we can't, we're not going to be in the trade space. I mean, it's just, it would be such an admission of failure by all of us. So I'm very grateful for your support in that area. I would also note that we talk about manufacturing jobs being lost because of Chinese practices. The reality is that farmers have been hurt as much as anyone by their practices. That's a huge market. They're second or third biggest agricultural market if you skip over 18 and go back to 17 and traditional years. But the reality is they should be buying much, much more agricultural products. And my hope is that these purchases as part of this, while not central, will lead to that, will lead to new markets that will go on for years and years and years.
All right. Thank you, Ambassador. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
好的，各位观众朋友，在刚才这一段时间的这个交锋中间呢，这个有议员呢，他是选自于堪萨斯州，就是在美国中西部的这个农业大州。这个议员很关心的事情呢，是说你一再强调莱特希泽大使一再强调这个301就是强调美国的知识产权。他说呢，这个会不会因为301结果使得美国的农产品的外销变成了代罪羊？这个也就是说，也许中国愿意在301这件事情上呢，更尊重美国的知识产权。那么结果呢，相对的，结果美国的这个农产品呢就被遭到了轻忽。农民成了代罪羔羊，会不会这样子？那么另外一个呢，就是说对于这个像堪萨斯州来讲，那么因为这种贸易战，相互的这种贸易升高关税，结果呢，美国的这个农产运输农产出口受到了很大的打击，包含这种大豆 包含这个肉类产品等等对于农民来讲，这个伤害是很大的。所以呢，这议员呢也是希望说早日能够达成协议。这个协议呢就可以使得双方的贸易战呢，不但是不要升级，而且能够有机会逐渐消弭战火。那么就恢复美国的农产品的出口，这个是议员很大的期望。好了，我们来继续看这个莱特希泽的这个回答。
Many Chinese businessmen themselves, but Chinese American businessmen universally have said to the president and to me for the president, hang tough. This is really, really, really important. We have to do things that lead to reform in China. We are not forcing reform in China. We are working with reformers in China who want to reform China. And nobody knows better how important that is than Chinese American business people, men and women. They absolutely know what the problem is. And they realize also what the potential is. If China takes a step forward and changes these practices, the potential for them and really the potential for us, but also I would say the potential for China is enormous. And that's why, in fact, China has reformers, and that's why it has people who want to change some of these policies. The reality is that all of our businesses, and their group probably more than any, are afraid to do business at some tier. They're afraid to do business with China because they will lose not only what we think of as technology, but also know-how, just how they do business, that they will not have their intellectual property protected and respected, and that there are huge markets that they could open up if we get this kind of thing reformed. But I would be really interested the next time you go back and do that and talk to them, if you call me and tell me, and I'll come up and talk to you, because I'd be very interested to know what their reaction is to what we're doing. I find these people follow this stuff really a lot closer than most Americans do. And when I talk to them, they're like, hang tough. Don't go for as many congressmen of your colleagues, don't go for the soybean solution. Go for the structural change. This is our one chance. I'd be really interested to get your feedback after you talk to these men and women.
We'll make sure we do that. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman, and I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Let me recognize Mr. Schweikert to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, let's face it, some of the best questions have already been asked, so I actually have a one-off. How do we future-proof? Let's say you have amazing success. The angels sing, whatever happens. What do we do to future-proof a success? Is it time that those of us here in Congress have a serious discussion on streamlining the WTO? Its level of being almost ineffectual. The number of filings that, when we read through them, we're a decade later and a tweak has been made and the bad acts are still happening. What do we do so we're not back having the same discussion a year, 2 years, 3 years from now?
Okay, well, thank you, Congressman. I want you to know that after the number of hearings that I've done before the committee, whenever I think of the future, I think of you. You're always going to ask me a question about that I should be thinking more about the future. So
it's either a good thing or an annoying thing.
Well, it's a good thing in my opinion. It's we all have a tendency to think about the here and now probably more than we should. So thinking about going off into the future is something that's important. I would say number one, having a real enforcement process. That enforcement process is going to, as you resolve issues, if you're doing it properly, you're going to be resolving issues in ways that turn up new problems and new trends. And I think you have to be able to deal within that process. And as I've tried to say, I'm not Pollyanna. I don't believe that this is going to solve all the problems between the United States and China. We have very different systems. They're in a process of reform, or they're not. Depends on who you talk to. If they're in a process of reform, we'll make headway. If they're not, we're going to go right back to having problems. But I think there is a role for the international bodies. I absolutely do. And I think WTO reform is an important part of it.
But with that, if
it's a process. The sins on the bilateral organizations, is it the timeline, the ability to stall, or is it just the actual adjudication process itself? What can we help in reforming so we're not doing this all the time?
I would say, first of all, trying to look to the future and try to reduce problems is a healthy and important process. But I believe we're going to have problems in any way. So I think we're going to be back here and we're going to be working our way through problems and try to work through those problems always with one eye to the future. But this enforcement process, if we have an agreement, and once again we don't have an agreement, will be very specific. It'll have layers, it'll have time frames, and there will be reaction. And working with Congress on WTO reform is something that I'm eager to engage in when your schedule permits it. I think there are problems with the WTO that we have to address, and it hasn't risen to the occasion with respect to at least non-market economies.
Mr. Chairman, look, to that point, one of my great interests is, I believe there's technology disruptions, there's always economic disruptions, there's, financing technology that's going to create international disruptions, and we will need some types of dispute mechanisms that move efficiently. How many times have we had constituents come to our office saying, well, we were part of this WTO complaint, but by the time the lawyer fees and everything, we're sitting here, a decade later, we gave up. And it would be a powerful thing as we look at this all over the world. Can we be helpful in fixing that process? And with that, I yield back, Mr.
Thank you, gentlemen. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Sanchez, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you to Ambassador Lighthizer for joining us today. A number of my colleagues have talked about, they have mentioned enforcement mechanisms. And I'm wondering if you are able to share with any specificity how you intend any agreements with China to be enforced.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. I would say I'll do it with limited specificity.
Okay.
So there will be, if we have an agreement, there will be a process that has been agreed to, where at the office director level there'll be monthly meetings, and then I'll go through the process. Then I'll take a step back. At the vice ministerial level, there will be quarterly meetings, and then there'll be semi-annual meetings at the ministerial level. That would be me and the vice premier, who is my counterpart in this. And the idea is two things. One, individual companies will come to us with complaints about practices, and we'll be able to work those through the process. In many cases, those are going to have to be anonymous because companies are afraid to come forward because they know what will happen if they do. They'll have real-world effects that'll be negative. And then in addition to that, there'll be systemic problems where we will see patterns developing and series of things that we disagree with, and we will bring those through the process. Hopefully, in most cases, they'll be resolved at the first or second level. If not, they'll be resolved at my level, and if there's disagreement at my level, then the United States would expect to act proportionately but unilaterally to insist on enforcement. But without that kind of thing, and I should say this is a fairly unique idea, right? I mean, this is not something that has a lot of precedent. But without that sort of thing, to me, then we don't have real commitments.
Thank you. That's helpful because, of course, many people complain that if there's no enforceability, then our trade agreements are not really worth the paper that they're written on. And I know that there are a number of moving parts in the ongoing negotiations, but one sector that I want to call to your attention because it's very important to the economic viability of Southern California is the creative industry. 95% of people who are involved in the creative industry in LA are union workers who have quality negotiated benefits and retirement plans. And the audiovisual sector at large is pretty much hamstrung by how to invest and distribute in China. Specifically, I want to call your attention for current MOU negotiations. I want to call to your attention a commitment that was made by the Chinese in 2012 in the 2012 film agreement, they said that in 2017, they would provide, quote, additional meaningful compensation, end quote, in terms of increasing revenue shares to U.S. studios. And it seems clear that a revenue share of at least 40% of gross box office would be consistent with international norms. Given that resolving this issue would be indicative of China's compliance with the WTO obligations under a trade dispute settlement, can you confirm that that is a priority for the negotiations and a trade deal with China?
Yes, Congressman, absolutely. It's a priority. It's something we've spent a fair amount of time talking about. They know precisely where we are. As you know, it's a complicated issue. The key point, revenue sharing, isn't that complicated, though. They can try to make. Secretary Mnuchin has been very much involved, and he, of course, knows a great deal about that industry, a lot more than I do. The distribution thing becomes more complicated. There should be some changes there, too. But what we haven't done is things that will challenge control, right? It's not something that we want to bring into this, the idea of challenging control in China. But this idea, the revenue sharing, I don't want to get into the details, but I think you probably know them exactly as well as I do. That is something that has not been resolved. It's something we've spent time on. It's something we understand the importance of.
Thank you. I appreciate that, and I yield back.
I thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Texas, Mr. Arrington.
在刚才这一轮的这个询答当中啊，这个有议员很有意思，这个等于是请莱特希泽还占卜一下未来。就是你觉得这个美中之间的这种贸易的关系啊，未来究竟是比较乐观呢，比较悲观？或者你就用个最简单的字，未来是好呢还是不好？这个莱特希泽说，未来就是不好预卜的了。但如果你一定要讲是好还是不好，我觉得未来会好。为什么呢？他说，其中一个就是因为美国这一次啊和这个中国的这个贸易谈判是个非常务实的做法。这个务实的内容之一啊，就是美国啊要求中国所做的事情必须是能够见机履机的，是能够确实实践的，是从中央到地方啊都要能够做到的。所以他觉得这样子的话，这个事情啊未来就会美中的这个贸易关系啊会比较好。那么这个议员呢还问到的就是美国现在和中国或者跟其他国家也是有这种贸易纠纷的时候，就提请 WTO 世界贸易组织来仲裁。可是呢这个仲裁往往耗费很长的时间，等这仲裁出来的时候呢，这个损害已经造成了。所以有没有办法有一个比较强有力的机制真正的能够很快的解决问题，让这个伤害减到最小？那么这个莱特希泽后来回答另外一个议员的时候，提到同样的这个议员也问了这个问题。前面一个议员呢问完了之后，时间到了。莱特希泽没办法回答了。那么后来这个议员又问到的时候，这个莱特希泽他说是这一次呢，这个美中贸易谈判其中一个就是要成立一个这个纠纷的处理机制，也就是说不必等到送到 WTO 那个地方裁决，我们彼此之间是不是能够有建立一个这样的一个有效的机制？因为这个机制不只是保护美国嘛，也是保护你中国嘛。这个发生贸易纠纷的时候，能够不要拖延时日。另外呢，还提到一个很要紧的事情呢，就是说。这个在这一次的这个双方的贸易谈判呢，就希望能够建立一个对话的机制。这对话的机制啊，就是这个执行层级的，就是比方像这个司处级的官员，能够每个月都要见面，也许在华府，也许在北京，也许一来一回吧，每个月都要见一次面。然后呢，这个副部长层级的是这个每3个月要见一次面，这一年的4季啊，每一季要见一次面，这个副部长层级。然后呢，再有一个就是部长层级的，就是像这个莱特希泽或者是这个美国的这个商务部或者是中国方面的这个对口单位，每半年都要见一次。也就是说，希望能够这个不是说好像好长的一段时间，然后把这问题都累积了，而是说这个有问题。马上这个月就要见面了嘛，这个月就来想办法帮他解决。如果这个问题更大一点，那不用太担心，3个月之后，副部长层级要见面的，这都是这个在未来的这个美中贸易的对话中间，希望能够建立起这样的一个比较密集磋商的积极机制。好了，这是刚才莱特希泽的回答，我们现在再来继续看他其他的这些询答内容。
And Secretary Perdue, as you know, is I don't know all the secretaries of agriculture, but I can't imagine there's ever a better one. He's just full on everything for agriculture, and we happen to be in the middle of a long-term trend that has been very bad. So all of that is appreciated, and the President keeps us very focused on it, as does the Secretary. In terms of the purchase commitment, absolutely cotton is a factor. It's something that China needs, has traditionally bought, and it's easy to buy more of. So it is something we understand that these people have suffered, and it's something that's in the list of things that we expect them to have substantial increases on, and it's something the President keeps us very focused on. And I have specifically gone through with the President the various items. So I'm talking to the President of the United States about these numbers for these ag. And by the way, it's these big commodities. It's hazelnuts. There's a lot of things that I've had members talk to me about, and I keep track of it, and I go through it dutifully.
You're doing a great job. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. Now, based upon the ratio present in the room, we will now move to 2 Democrats and then recognize 1 Republican. Ms. Delbeni is recognized to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here with us today. I was pleased last month. We saw 76 countries agree to start negotiations to develop global rules on e-commerce. However, I'm concerned that the recent inclusion of China in these talks could weaken those overall efforts and lead to a watered-down agreement, since their current digital regime is so radically different than ours. In your bilateral talks with the Chinese, are you pushing them to address critical issues like data localization, forced disclosure of source code, restrictions on cloud service providers, and banning customs duties on electronic transmissions? This would not only help many American companies operate in China, but would also help make China a more constructive partner in important multilateral negotiations like the e-commerce initiative. And if we don't address these issues immediately, we risk creating new digital borders, and those digital borders could create massive disruptions in the digital supply chains that we have. So I'd love your thoughts on how you're addressing these issues.
Well, thank you very much, Congresswoman. This is something that I care about, so I'm putting this in the softball category. Number one, I completely agree with you. Strategically, what we should be doing is having a small group that writes real rules on e-commerce and then expand the group to other people. The more people you bring into the negotiation, the harder it is to get any rules that you and I would think of and many other members would think of as actually world-class kind of rules. The kind of rules we need, by the way, I would just point out, are in USMCA, right? That's like the gold standard for all of this stuff. It's the absolute gold standard for all of this stuff. And it's probably a bridge too far with respect to some of these people. But I think bringing China in it will not help these negotiations. That's number one. Number two, are we dealing with these issues with China? Absolutely. We spend an enormous amount of time on data localization, on data transfer, on source codes requirements in a whole variety of areas. And I mean down to absolutely the most minute detail. And I'm happy to sit down with you at some point and kind of go through it just so you can get some actual appreciation. But I mean, it's me sitting down with among the most senior officials there, talking about precisely where there are circumstances in which it's appropriate to require source codes. And there are some, emergency rooms. There are some strange things, but we have had we haven't concluded, we're not done yet, but we have made headway. It's whatever it is, it's not going to be what you and I think of as a model agreement, but we will make substantial progress, I believe. And these are really, really important issues and I agree completely with you. This is one of those things. We should lock in rules that stop barriers in the beginning of an industry. Once you get protectionism set in all over the world, it's much harder to change practices than it is to have people adopt best practices at the beginning. And so it's very important. It's also a big issue for just colloquially for us. We're good at it, and we ought to have that.
So as you know, U.S. technology companies and specifically cloud service providers face significant market restrictions and forced technology transfer requirements in China. The 301 tariffs also impact them because another key inputs to data centers are subject to these tariffs. And so particularly when we talk about that, I'd like to know what your commitments are to pursuing forced technology transfers, but also are you looking at things like eliminating foreign equity caps and licensing requirements so that U.S. companies don't have to rely on Chinese companies to operate?
Yes.
Thank you. I know we're out of time. We can follow up more too. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from California, Ms. Chu, to inquire.
Yes,
Ambassador
Lighthizer, I represent Los Angeles, the heart of the film, television, and music industry.
其中一个就是说，这个莱特希泽强调说，这次和美国、中国之间的贸易谈判，美国要求的不是说你中国要多购买美国东西，而是说你中国必须做一些结构性的改变。这也是川普总统非常清楚的指令。这个是美国在和中国谈判的时候，这一次所把握的重点。那么这个还提到了一个，就是议员呢也是建议这个莱特希泽说，我们也是这么做的。那就是说，这不只是说美国的行政部门，或者是美国的联邦贸易代表，或者是这个商务部、财政部对中国的谈判，而是整个美国的很多相关的行业，包含消费者、包含产业界共同的观点。莱特希泽说：“是的，这一次其实在汇整各方意见的时候，就是把很多也许不是那么有名的，也许是一个小团体的，把他们的意见共同汇整起来。这个照中国人讲，团结力量大。而在和中国谈判的时候，就是包含在国会里边的一些共同的看法，这个包含着行政部门的企业界共同的看法，把它结合起来，在和中国在谈判的时候，就让中方了解到，美国这是一个几乎是一个举国一致的关切事项。”那么要求中国做出一些改变。好的，这个现在在这个咨询呢是这个赵美心，是我们华裔的人啊，我们来听莱特希泽的回答。
Predated the current 301 process, but now because we haven't made sufficient progress, we're folding him into this 301 process, and it is one of the services issues. The revenue share, as you said, is crucial, but also trying to make some improvement on the distribution side of things. Because the reality is that competition there helps also. You know, I don't know if I can predict success. I would say they are very difficult negotiations, you know, as of the last time they were here. But your industry is very well represented by you and other members and by MPAA, and so you know, we're focused very much on it, and I think making it part of these negotiations increases the likelihood of a successful outcome. But it's a difficult issue. You find just philosophically in all these kinds of areas that you sort of dig in and you say, why is there this or that protectionism? And it's almost always a situation where there's an interest in the other country that has an actual, you know, is getting richer as a result of it. It's very seldom philosophy, although there are cases where it is. But in this case, there are people there who make money on basically squeezing us, number one. Number two, they want to develop their own industry. Yeah. So there are, as you know, I don't have to go through it. You know the reasons why we have this problem, but it's something that we are focused on. Hopefully we'll come to a conclusion. We're not asking for the moon at all. What we're asking for is what is normal.
Well, I thank you for continuing to press on that issue in these trade negotiations. Also, I wanted to make a statement about a company in my district, iRobot, which employs 675 American workers, engineers, scientists, and which developed the famous Roomba, the robotic vacuum. So it employs so many people in my district, but the Roomba is manufactured in China. And the iRobot is on that third list of tariffs. Right now, iRobot is paying 10% in retaliatory duties, but it may go up to 25% if the deal is not reached. And so they are very, very anxious about having some way to apply for exclusions for that third list, and I just hope that you can make that process happen.
Well, I have certainly taken the position that if we go to 25%, we will. I've made that commitment, have an exclusion process. Short of that, I want to sort of see where we are, and I hope that they're thinking about ways to manufacture more in the U.S.
Yes, thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from North Carolina, Mr. Holding, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Ambassador, always a pleasure. I'm very glad to see that the administration is willing to tackle China's unfair trade practices rather than just talking about it and complaining about it. I think we have bipartisan support in the room to agree that China is a strategic trading partner that plays by the rules when it behooves them, but otherwise ignores them. And Mr. Ambassador, as you know, I'm from North Carolina, which not only has the best barbecue in the country, but we're also one of the leading pork-producing states in the country. I'm glad I didn't hear any objection to that.
We won't subtract that from the gentleman's time.
In 2017, the U.S. shipped over $1 billion in pork to China, but with punitive tariffs over 50%, our pork exports to China have slowed down to a trickle. The lost sales to China have caused hog producers in my state to lose $8 per hog, and collectively an annualized loss of $1 billion. And I know you've made progress with agricultural purchases, especially for soy and poultry, and I appreciate your good work there on behalf of my farmers. But obviously, there's a tremendous demand for pork in China, and with the Chinese pork production in steep decline because of African swine fever, it seems like it is time for significant U.S. pork shipments to China, which would, of course, put a big dent in the trade imbalance. So can you give us any indications as to where you are on pork market access in the negotiations?
So thank you, Congressman. Yes, that's, but you're absolutely right. Pork is one of the issues that's very important to us. Before we talk about the purchasing, it's also important on the SPS area, where we have specific problems with lack of scientific basis for some of their restrictions. So that's another area in which it comes in. Pork is something we've talked about. We would expect, if we have a deal, that there would be substantial pork improvements, particularly, as you know well, given the fact that China has issues with their own pork production right now that are substantial. And this is something we have talked about. It has been quite specifically addressed, and we have gone back and forth with numbers. So, and I'm happy to talk to you about it offline, but we are making headway, and if there's a deal, and if there's a package, I'm confident that there will be there will be substantial good news for our pork producers.
Thank you. Switching to 301 tariffs, we're working with you to find ways to work on the exclusion process. One option in particular I'd like to work with you on is the criteria that expeditiously excludes products that are regulated by other U.S. government agencies, where those regulations already constrain the ability of importers to access those products. For example, products regulated by the FDA, where the FDA's regulatory framework means that consumers cannot quickly shift to other suppliers. The existing regulations by our government already constrain supply for the consumer, and I believe we have an opportunity with the List 3 exclusion process to address these products and minimize consumer impact. So that's the area which I hope that we can work on together in the future. That doesn't really require an answer, and I'm out of time, and that works well. I yield back.
I thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Wisconsin to
刚才这个莱特希泽回答的时候啊，谈到一个非常简单的回答，但是却说明了这次美中谈判美国所坚持的一个原则。就是这个当时这个议员的问到说，这个美中贸易谈判呢，你面临到的一些比较重大的挑战等等。这个莱特希泽说，他说我们呢现在和中国谈判要求的不是什么非分之情，我们要求的是一个正常关系。这个所谓正常关系啊，就是你不要偷我的，这个照价付钱，就是大家按照规章行事，各自履行承诺。所以他提到了这么一个，我们美国要的是什么？就是一个正常的和中国之间的贸易关系。另外呢，还有议员就提到了这个，这是从这个也是农产州出来的。他说这个农产品里面包含猪肉啊，这个销往中国这件事情。这个莱特希泽提到，事实上这也是美国讲了好久的。 就有些国家不让美国的猪肉或者美国的牛肉进口，是因为这个担心的这个检验的，或者是当初这个比方像这个牛肉这个瘦肉精等等。他说呢，这个莱特希泽说就牵涉比较多，但是呢，这一次美中之间贸易谈判是一个包裹谈判，就是我们定一个协议，把很多的这个吵了好久的事情一次做一个清楚的解决，所以他觉得应该是可以获致一个，他有信心。这个能够获致解决，就是这个让美国的这个猪肉出口应该是有比较大的机会的。好，那么这个是刚才的这个询答。好，我们继续来看这个在现场美国国会的听证会。
Thus undercutting the prices of their products.
I'm, of course, sympathetic to your objective. It's not something that we've talked about, and if there is a specific unfair trade action that we should be thinking about, I'd be happy to work with you about it, but it's not something we've spent time talking about.
Okay, I would love to work with you on that, because that could severely undercut our products, our iPhones with these minerals in it. We want to make sure that they're not being produced or taken from countries where people are being murdered. And unfair labor practices.
I'm very sympathetic to your.
I do want to follow up with my colleague on the Republican side, talked about lists of things that are really critical. And I know that my colleague from Wisconsin probably waxed on about how this is hurting our folks in Wisconsin. More specifically, I have an initiative to try to prevent sudden infant death syndrome. And one of the products that we have found to be very effective and cost-effective, especially for poor women, is something that's marketed in the United States as a pack and play. It's a cribette that's only made in China, and it's been subject to these 10% tariffs. And if we were to continue these tariffs, it would be out of the reach of many consumers. And so I was wondering how to get these pack and plays on that list of don't touch items. Because we can't get these pack and plays from anywhere else.
Well, thank you, first of all, and I can't help but say how important USMCA is for Wisconsin. Now, having said that, my guess is we ought to be manufacturing pack and plays in the United States. Why is it that they can't be manufactured here?
Well, can you manufacture them before my great-granddaughter is born March 23rd?
Well, maybe we'll just let you use my granddaughter's version. She can just say she doesn't need it anymore. She's outgrown it. So, no, I don't want to be flip about it. I'm sympathetic. The bottom line is, we ought to be manufacturing these things in the United States. That's what our objective is. We ought to be paying people here to manufacture these things. And I would also say a 10% tariff on that product, assuming it doesn't go up, a 10% tariff on that product versus what it would have cost 6 months ago with the devaluation of the Chinese currency, it's probably a 2 or 3% increase in price. My guess is it's not going to price too many people out. And if the cost of that 2 or 3% on the price of that is a bunch of people have jobs that they wouldn't otherwise have, personally, that's a trade I'd make.
Thank the gentlelady. Let me recognize the gentleman from Michigan to inquire. Mr. Kildee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for holding this hearing, and thank you, Ambassador Lighthizer, for being here. And beyond that, thank you for your willingness to engage with us on a regular basis. It makes a difference, and I very much appreciate that. You've been quite accessible. And I have a question, but before I get into that, I'd also want to note how much I appreciate you bringing up the polysilicon issue with the Chinese during these negotiations. It's important that we address China's retaliatory tariffs in response to legitimate American trade remedies. That's important to me. It's important to my district, and I appreciate your efforts in that regard. Obviously, the Congress and the administration need to work together to deal with China and to hold China accountable for unfair practices that are costing American jobs. And I think there's general agreement on that score, bipartisan agreement. Many of us wish that it was more of a multilateral approach, but One area that I know was addressed, but I wasn't here to hear your answer, has to do with currency manipulation. President Trump promised to label China a currency manipulator on his first day in office during his campaign. Obviously, that didn't happen. And I know you agree with the president's general sentiment that China engages in bad behavior and manipulates currency. In fact, in 2010, you testified to this committee that China should be labeled a currency manipulator and was in violation of its WTO obligations. You have thoughtfully outlined a list of actions that the U.S. needs to take to address China's currency manipulation, but I would like to get your perspective on whether or not the understanding that the president recently announced with China on currency issues meets the requirements that you had laid out in your previous testimony. Simply put, does this deal meet the standards that you laid out in 2010?
Well, thank you. I appreciate that. I would say, first of all, whether or not China is manipulating its currency right now, competitive, is an issue that we can talk about. It probably is, but it's probably not manipulating it to lower its currency. It's probably manipulating it to raise its currency because they're in a different position than they were in 2010. So that's one thing I would say. It is not a foregone conclusion that China is manipulating its currency down right now. And I would say that this is a decision that the Secretary of Treasury makes in conjunction with the President, not me. But I do not think you can make a case that right now China is intervening in the market to have their currency be weaker. Right? That's not in their interest, and they're probably doing the exact opposite of it. Have they done it in the past? In my judgment, absolutely true. And were they doing it when I made that testimony? That's absolutely true.
And I don't think you can rule out the possibility that some moment in the future we could see that happen again. And that's why the structural approach to these issues is more important than looking at this moment in time, or even in the context of a deal that we might see negotiated is founded on sort of temporary transactional benefits as opposed to structural benefits.
I completely agree with your statement, absolutely 100%. And what we want to get is commitments to not have competitive devaluations in the future and to a certain level of transparency. If you have those two things and they're enforceable, then you can guard against that problem in the future. And the other point I made before you weren't here is that this is an issue beyond China. We think of it as China. There's a lot of places in Asia where this is a problem and a lot of places where it has been a problem in the past. And there's a lot of people in the United States that aren't working right now because of this issue. A lot of people who were told, well, you just didn't do a good job, and they were doing a fine job. They just got cheated on currency.
My time's expired. I appreciate your
各位观众朋友，在刚才这几分钟的这个询答中间呢，又提到了这个汇率问题。这个议员呢总是怀疑说中国在这个汇率上是人为操控的，来增加它的这个对美的经济的这个优势。那么这个莱特希泽说，他说这个现在的情况和2010年的时候又不太一样。那么所以呢，你说中国有没有操控汇率呢？这个事情呢是很难讲的。如果他操控汇率，他未必是他刻意的让汇率偏低，也许他是刻意让汇率偏高啊。但是过去中国有没有这么做？有的。我以前这个在国会的询答时候就讲过。但此刻有没有做呢？但是我们也未必有这样的证据。那么这个是有关于这个汇率的问题。刚才还有议员提到的，就是中国有没有这个血汗工厂？这个说这个血汗工厂就用偏低的这个人力成本来这个造成它对于美国享有的这种这个出口的优势。那么另外一方面呢，也提到了就是在这种贸易战的这种相互的升高贸易升高关税，对于这个彼此的经济的这个影响，这就是议员比较关心的。但是这个议员呢，一个一个问议员自己的时间呢，这个多少时间？这个有的时候就不一定有时间让这个莱特希泽回答。但是议员呢，就充分的表达他们对于这些各个议题的关注。好了，我们继续，现在又听到就是有关农业的问题吧，来听听看。
While the administration has made progress in gaining access, since 2017, China has been displacing U.S. rice in our territories by undercutting the price. So while U.S. rice struggles for access, China's access to our domestic market below traded prices continues to grow Are you and the administration investigating the situation, and what are you doing to address it?
So, thank you, Congressman. Yes, absolutely. First of all, to your first point, structural issues are fundamental to what we're talking about, and I've tried to make that point. I read in the media all the time. I read today in the New York Times that we weren't making any headway on structural, and it didn't even cite anybody. It made some other comments, by the way, and it cited contacts of Lighthizer. I thought, what's a contact? Is that like somebody I bump into at the grocery store? Contacts. That's a source, is a contact. But that's another issue. I won't get into it. In any event, any further than I already have, the fact is that we are making headway on structural issues, contrary to what may be read here and there, and the President believes they are central to having what anyone would consider to be a great agreement. And that's what his instructions to me. His instructions to me are, you have to get a great agreement, or we have no agreement. We'll just wait until we can get a great agreement. So now on the specific issue of rice, yes, rice number one is a subject of purchasing that we have to have. Number two, we have, as you know well, we have 2 WTO cases, one of which we have won and been announced, the other which has been decided but it hasn't become public, so I won't tell you where we are on that. But those are 2 cases, and resolving those cases in the context of this agreement is something else that we're talking about. So whether we succeed in that, we'll see. But on the issue of unfair Chinese access in the United States, if there are issues where someone has a case that they want to bring and have my office talk about, I'm happy to talk about it. I, as you know very well, because we've talked a lot, I'm completely into enforcement. I think if we don't enforce these laws, the whole basic consensus in favor of the trading system breaks down, and I think it has broken down. So I'm happy to act on that, very quickly.
Thank you, Ambassador. I have several other questions I'll just submit for the record, hopefully to get the response, but appreciate your response.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Virginia, Mr. Beyer.
Mr. Chairman, thank you. And Ambassador, thank you so much for being with us all this time. Ambassador, we've been discussing, and of course you're particularly compelling on the point about how China simply refuses to operate under what we consider to be a lawful and rules-based trading system. And of course, this extends beyond just trading rules. On Monday, Deputy Attorney General Rosenstein spoke at CSIS about what he called China's transactional approach to the law, citing China's willingness to detain foreign nationals on specious charges to gain negotiating leverage or force an outcome from a foreign government. This isn't how our justice system works, or it's not supposed to work that way. After the Huawei CFO's arrest, the president said, quote, "If I think it's good for what will certainly be the largest trade deal ever made, which is a very important thing, what's good for national security, I would certainly intervene if I thought it was necessary," end quote. And during your meeting in the Oval Office with the Chinese Vice Premier, the president again discussed the possibility of, quote, talking to the U.S. attorneys, quote, and talking to the Attorney General. He hinted further that this would be a subject for trade talks. I know you're not responsible for law enforcement. I know you're not responsible for the Huawei prosecution, but you're certainly responsible for the trade deal. Are you familiar at all with any further discussions within the administration regarding using this case as leverage for trade negotiations? We've seen firsthand that you're willing to be forthright with the president. Are you not concerned that adopting a transactional approach to the criminal justice system, close to what the Chinese would do, will undermine our own legal system and incentivize reciprocal actions, as we've already seen with the Chinese targeting of Canadian citizens?
I'm not aware of anything on this subject. I don't get involved with it, and I'm not aware of it at all involved in what I'm doing.
All right. Thank you. Most of our national trade discourse, particularly the popular discourse, centers around heavy manufacturing and agriculture, despite the fact that 75% of Americans employed in the private sector work in services of one form or other. In my district, we have tens of thousands support their families with good jobs across a wide range of services. I know you really focus on the trade deficit in goods and left out services altogether. I always want to make sure that we know we run a surplus in services. But nevertheless, both the National Trade Estimate and the Chinese WTO compliance report note that American service companies face significant trade barriers across a number of sectors. And given our general competitive advantage in these areas, it's safe to assume the service surplus could be a lot larger. China places significant restrictions on legal services, ICT, cloud services, a whole range. Can you provide us with some detail on how the concerns raised about services are addressed in your current talks? And can we expect concrete changes in Chinese competitive behavior in this sector too?
Yeah, thank you very much. And I'm remiss in not making that point clearly. Services is a crucial part of what we talked about, and we spent a lot of time on it. I brought one of my many negotiation books, which I'll be happy to show you at some time, because somebody looked at it and saw the notes, and they said, God, that really is a terrible job you have, Lighthizer. But here it is. Banking services we spent a lot of time on, cloud computing services, credit rating services, electronic payment, express delivery. I won't go through all of them here because someone will say, my God, insurance services. I mean, we spent a lot of time in great detail, right down to the sub section on pages and pages and pages of services. And you're exactly right. Services jobs are equally good jobs. The United States has a surplus in services, which is very important, and millions and millions of people work on them. And we should be doing much better, because in many areas we are by far the most competitive in the world. So this had an enormous amount of time spent on it, and it's sort of less thematic and more specific, right, if you can follow what I mean in these negotiations. But there was progress made on a number of these fronts.
Thank you very much, Mr.
好的，各位观众朋友，刚才这个议员呢，又有人提到了华为这件事情，大家都了解啊。这个华为啊，可能对美国至少这边也有人在讲，对这个美中之间的贸易可能会有些影响。但是这个莱特希泽讲，他说他完全没有牵涉到这件事情，所以呢，他也根本无从回答起。在之前的时候如果是比较晚一点加入我们的这个行列啊。刚才也有议员提到了华为，那么这个莱特希泽也是说，华为这个事情是一个司法案件。我今天跟中国谈的是经贸议题，所以呢，两者并没有任何相关。那么刚才还有议员问到的就是有关于这个服务业的问题。这个莱特希泽啊，他就翻他的这个笔记本呢，他说你们可以看看我这个笔记本啊，你们就会发现，哎呦，你这个莱特希泽跟人家讨论的这么多，他确实，你看这一页一页他翻给这个。当然，别人看不见了，这个距离这么远了，但他就看得出来。他说，你看这一页一页里边，我们和中国谈这个银行业的问题，谈这个保险业的问题，谈这个就信用平等机构的问题。他说，我们跟中国谈了非常非常多有关于开放服务业的问题，而且谈了非常多的细节，非常深入。他说呢，这是花了很多时间谈的，也就是美国和中国谈的这个经贸的问题啊。这一次的希望达成的协议啊，这个是一个内容非常广泛的，包含的希望中国有一些结构性的改革。那么如果你这个中国容许更多的美国服务业进去，那也等于是在这个结构性改革中的一环吧。好了，我们来继续再看这个现场，莱特希泽又在翻他的这个笔记本了。
We went through section by section by section of what we would consider to be sort of best practices intellectual property protection are, and we negotiated those provisions. We didn't get everything we want, but you need things like a proper definition of what intellectual property is, a proper definition of what trade secrets are. You have to make sure you have criminal enforcement at some point in the process. You have to make sure you have deterrent level penalties, because if you don't have that, you have a problem. You have to make sure you have neutral people making decisions. It's all the kinds of things that you would say, yeah, that's more or less what we would expect in a system. Now there's variation, and as I say, we didn't get all of it. But the people with whom we dealt in China want to reform this process. I think they legitimately want to reform it. I think they legitimately view themselves as creators of intellectual property instead of just consumers of it. And when that changes, people have a different attitude. So Chinese creators of intellectual property now want protection and have more power than they would have in the past. So we have an enormous amount of detail. I'll just spend 10 seconds and show you my book when we're together, and you can sort of see. But this was a detailed discussion. It's extremely important. And I would say the final thing, when they put this in place to the extent it's agreed to, because they think it's in their interest too, then there'll be the enforcement issue, right? We'll be going down. It's going to be as a change for China to do this, but it's something they seem to want to do.
Real quick, Mr. Ambassador, you raised the issue about banking. Development projects and companies relying on Chinese investment to infuse capital into their projects and work. The restrictions on capital inflow is a concern for future investment.
Well, look, the president wants Chinese investment just like he wants everybody else's investment. That creates jobs and it helps Americans. What we don't want is investment in areas where they're going to end up taking crucial technology from the United States. So there's a balance there, and some people will come in and what they really want is technology and not investment. In other cases, they want investment. The president's position and the Secretary of Treasury's position is quite clear. We want investment from China, just like we do from everyone else. But we don't want investment where it's going to go into crucial technologies and end up losing technologies, which is going to hurt us in the kind of things that Mr. Bauer talked about and cares a lot about. So there's a balance there, and it's very important that we meet that balance properly.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, we will recognize the gentleman from Illinois, Mr. LaHood, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Ambassador Lighthizer, welcome back, and thank you for your toughness on China. And we're lucky to have you as our negotiator going up against China. I have the 8th largest ag district in the country in terms of corn and soybean production, heavy manufacturing base, and there is a lot of anxiety in both of those industries, as we've heard today. The Wall Street Journal just came out with an article in the last couple of months. The ag economy is down 13% over last year, directly related to tariffs, directly related to the trade war with China, and so a lot of stress and concern there. However, most of my constituents in my district support the president in going after China. And you mentioned at the beginning of your statement, quote, technology is going to rule the future. And how we change the behavior with China seems to be the crux of what you're getting at with your negotiations. And historically, looking over the last 25 years, no president from Clinton to Bush to Obama has been able to do anything on this front, whether it's cyber threats, forced technology transfer, stealing intellectual property. We have not been able to change that behavior to put China on the same playing field as every other industrialized country in the world. And that really seems to be what we're trying to get at. And having said that, you've talked a little bit about our leverage in this negotiating process. And as I look at what you're trying to do here, I'm wondering whether this is going to be different in terms of what's going to be different this time in changing the behavior in China. And I'm going to submit for the record, this is an article from Reuters within the last 2 months here, and the title is, China says U.S. accusations of unfair trade practices are groundless. And in there, the spokesman from China goes on to say that, says the U.S. side made groundless accusations, and China finds that totally unacceptable, and that's from their spokesperson. And I'll submit that for the record, Mr. Chairman. And I guess as we look at what you said earlier, how do we have structural change? How do we get to a more laws-based system? And I know that's what you're getting at. So 2 questions, Mr. Ambassador. First of all, on the ag side, as we begin planting season for our farmers, what assurances can you give my corn and soybean farmers and pork producers that the market share in China will be there when we resolve this eventually? And then secondly, as we look at this different approach that you're taking, what gives you confidence that this approach is going to be different? And what if it's not? What are the consequences to China if we're not able to hold them accountable moving forward and changing that bad behavior? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Congressman, for that question. It covered a lot of territory, and I have 1 minute now to respond, but I will do it as quickly as I can. First of all, in terms of the soy and corn, we are trying to, number one, get more sales, more purchases, not in the question of corn, it's also in the question of ethanol,
yep,
which of course is a huge user of corn products, of corn. So I believe if we have a deal, there'll be a substantial, in the case of soy, we've already seen a substantial amount of additional purchases recently, and we've seen a certain moving together of soy prices back to traditional levels in terms of the foreign competition. So we've seen some impact, particularly with the most recent 10 million metric ton purchases that the Chinese have gotten into the market for. So if we have a deal, I think we will see substantial new sales there and hopefully some other improvements in terms of SPS stuff. How is this different? It has to be enforceable. It's got to be specific. and we're covering many more areas than anyone's ever covered. But it requires the grit and determination of the president, and it really requires the cooperation of people who want to reform in China, and there are people in that. And the alternative is what's been going on, and that for sure failed. So we know that approach doesn't fail, and hopefully ours will succeed.
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize
这个一定要跟这个观众朋友多花点时间解说。那么刚才的这个议员呢问了一个问题啊，他说你要怎么样改变中国的行为模式？这议员一上来先感谢莱特希泽强硬的对待中国。这个议员说，中国的很多做法是不能接受的，却是这个美国呢是这个视而不见了这么多年啊，所以呢，他说现在莱特希泽这个川普总统用强硬的对待中国的这个要求中国要做一些改变，这议员是这个非常感谢的。但是呢，这个你看中国这么多的问题，你怎么样来改变中国的行为模式？让这个中国能够比较符合这种国际的规章，符合这个西方的主流的思潮所期待的。那么莱特希泽回答就是说，你问了这么多，可我只剩下1分钟的时间来回答，引起了一阵笑声。不过呢，他讲这个莱特希泽。他说呢，前面一个问题的时候，他也讲到类似的。他说，其实啊，在和中国谈判贸易问题的时候，你注意到了，中国自己里边也有很多希望改革的声音。你比方说，这个美国的要求保护知识产权，中国难道没有自己的知识产权吗？如果你窃取人家的知识产权，你有什么资格然后来指责别人也窃取你的知识产权？这天下不就大乱了吗？所以呢，他说这个随着中国的这些民众或者是中国也有一些要求改革的声音，你可以对于这个未来呢中国的这些做法呢，抱持着一些信心，中国会改变的。尤其是说，就回到了这一次的经贸谈判，最要紧的事情呢，就是美国要求是中国所做的承诺都是信而可称的，都是真正的可以核实的。所以他觉得这个中国的这个做法呢，会在这样的协议的约束之下会出现一些改变。那么这个莱特希泽还提到的就是有关于这个知识产权呢，在讨论的时候是非常花功夫。为什么呢？这牵涉到了很多像是这个认定啊，这个究竟这是知识产权或者是人家的商业机密，这个什么样的这个你来这个做法是构成了这个犯罪。这都是要花很多时间讨论的。好了，我们再继续看在现场莱特希泽的这个回答。
Markets not only overseas and in China, but actually in the United States, right? I mean, they literally are competing against people that have sold the stuff in the United States, and so we are making headway. People say, well, tariffs are a blunt instrument, and my response always is, but we don't have any other instrument, right? If Congress wants to sit down and talk to me and worry about creating new tools, I'm happy to do that. I'd love to do it. We're using the tools we have. We know that just sitting around blathering hasn't worked for 25 or 30 years, so we have to try something new, and I think we've gotten to a point where we might have success. We'll find out. Hopefully we'll have success. How will it be long-lasting? We'll see. The reality is this is going to be a challenge. It goes on for a long, long time. My guess is it goes on long after I've left, and hopefully by the time you're sitting in the chair, you'll be sitting there making sure that the people who are in my job are continuing to do that, because enforcement tends to be about people. And if we're not going to enforce this agreement, they'll figure it out pretty quickly, and that'll be the end of it. All we can do is try to set up a situation where we have the potential that if people go in here and have the right attitude, the tools will be there that they can be successful, and that's what our objective is. And we're using the tools that Congress has given us as imaginatively, I've told one of your colleagues, as imaginatively as possible. When I testified in 2010, I thought we have to have imagination. I think that's what the president has shown here, imagination and then grit, right?
If I can use my last couple of seconds to emphasize something else that you said as well, so thank you for that. You mentioned that technology is our biggest asset, and we have to protect that intellectual property, that technology. But it's more than that. It's the application of that technology in this country. It's the continued innovation to think about the next technology, and it's the alliances we build around the world to apply those. So I appreciate that. With my time up, I yield back.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Sawazi, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you so much for your public service. We really do appreciate the hard work that you do on behalf of the country. For decades, since President Nixon and Secretary Kissinger, and certainly since the end of the Cold War, the U.S. has operated under the assumption that with increased economic integration and exposure to our system of capitalism and democracy, that China would ultimately adopt some of our systems, at least in part. That simply hasn't happened. Not only has communist China eschewed democracy and engaged in awful human rights abuses, repression, and abuse of religious minorities, such as the Uyghurs and the Tibetan Buddhists. Not only have they polluted the air, the land, and the water and treated their workers poorly, but they've not transitioned to capitalism or a market economy. The Chinese state communist government not only cheats by stealing intellectual property, restricting access to their markets, but the Chinese government subsidizes its industry. The 2019 Fortune Global 500 includes 111 Chinese companies, of which 78 of those companies are viewed to be 50% or more owned by the state. Could you share with us your sense of what the long-term policy of the United States is and the goals that you have as part of this negotiation to have long-term structural change on this relationship?
Joshua, thank you for that question. That's a great opportunity, and all of your colleagues are saying, I hope Lighthizer is unusually short-winded. I would say this, you raised the fundamental question. There was a myth that grew up, and if you look at my 2010 testimony, which I think is really quite good testimony, it's been referred to on several occasions here today and in the past, the myth was that if you open up a market, if you have an economy, you will become democratic, small d democratic. That is the myth. You'll open up that will lead to an open economy and to an open political system, and all of a sudden we're all a bunch of people from Ohio, where I'm from, right? That's the myth. And the reality, and that was literally professed by all the smart people, all the clever people, and that really is what led us to PNTR. And it's precisely what I read. You weren't here. I read the speaker's quote, which was very prescient, saying this ain't so. And she said it, and she was right. And all those smart people were wrong. The reality is that it doesn't. You can have a very good economy and not have any freedom, or have very little freedom, right? You can. We made assumptions. Well, I didn't, but assumptions were made that were incorrect. So I completely agree. And the tone of your remarks were, without saying every specific part of it, are why we have a bipartisan view on this and why we're making success. It's because of people like you that we have success. If this was a partisan thing, it wouldn't be. The fact that it's bipartisan is why we're making success on this.
So what's the goals of this negotiation specifically to try and have long-term structural impact? And will we ever get to a place where we think that China represents something closer to what our system of capitalism is? I'm not going to put democracy on your shoulders too.
So I would say on the second one, we'll find out. You're younger than I am. You're more likely to have a better view, right? Because you'll get there and see it. I don't know what our objectives are. Our objectives are to foster reform in China, which there's a group of people that want to do, to lead to structural reforms on the kinds of things where we can within the confines of the statute that you've given us and the report that we did. Here's our report, and here's our, if you haven't seen it, and here's our supplement. And it's,
well, we can't get to the whole report in the last 3 seconds I have left, so I'm going to take you up on your offer to try and work with you to see if there are other tools the Congress can help to give you and people like you to be more effective in the future. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Kelly, to inquire.
这个议员呢提出来的一个问题，他说这个中国的这种种做法，今天不只是经贸上，他窃取美国的知识产权，窃取美国的这个商业机密，而且中国在人权方面，包含这个镇压少数民族，包含迫害这个维吾尔人，包含在这个人民的这个网络自由啊等等进一步的限缩。他说你和中国打交道的时候啊，你怎么样可以这个一方面呢，这个 看着中国在这种人权上的限缩，一方面寄望他能够尊重这些国际规章。这个莱特希泽回答，他说这是一个很大的迷思啊，很多很聪明的人都认为，就是当你这个经济发展到了一定程度，你的这个政治会走向民主。他说结果呢，这是一个迷思，意思就是这是一个不切实际的，这是个今天看到是一个错误的想法。很多国家是从经济改革走上了政治改革，但是也有这样的国家，就是在经济上获得很大的成就，但是在人民的自由上反倒是更为限缩了。他没有直接回答说美国究竟怎么样和中国打交道，但他提到了美国所面对的是一个非常奇特的国家，这个是美国在和中国谈经贸议题的时候所面临的困难。好了，这个我们继续来看这个在现场议员和这个莱特希泽彼此之间的询答。
This is absolutely stupid. We have allowed ourselves to get into this position. What could we do differently? And I want to tell you, I think most of it is stand 100% behind this administration and don't let these people get away with what they've been getting away from for so many years. An old saying, and this is very crude, but there's an old saying out there, if you're in a peeing contest with a skunk, the only way to beat him is to out-pee him. I got to tell you right now, I think we are in a trade war that has taken a heavy toll across the United States. And we sit back and we just don't want to offend anybody. I am so offended by us not being offensive that it is sickening what we've allowed to happen to manufacturing and intellectual properties. And you name it, we've been gamed so badly for so long. Anything else we can do to help you, Mr. Ambassador? Mr. Ambassador?
Well, let me say, first of all, it really is important, and I've said this is my theme, well, it's been my theme for 2 years, that these things have to be bipartisan. They cannot be partisan. This is just different than a lot of other stuff we deal with. And hearing the last two questions shows why exactly it is bipartisan, right? Why this is a fundamental, both intellectual and gut reaction to what is going on. And I think supporting us, supporting the president when we get this package together, if there is a package, and I'm not there yet, as I say all the time, that we have to look at it and get behind it. And say this is a great step forward, but you have to stay. You know, you have to keep your eye on making sure that we enforce it, and that I enforce it, and that my successors enforce it, and that years down the road that new presidents enforce it. So, and then the second thing I would suggest, which I've said before, I'd love to work with members on new tools. I think we need new tools. Yeah. I won't go through it here but what's happened to 301 is troubling, right? So, and I don't want to go through all
just because we talk about 232 and 301, I got to tell you, when I go back home in Western Pennsylvania, people don't look at me and say, tell me exactly what's in 232, or tell me what's happening with 301. That goes back to 1974, and the reason we did it is because of unfair, unreasonable, discriminatory trade practices, right? So these are things that Congress created for the President of the United States, the executive branch, to handle for us. I believe it's going to take eternal vigilance. I think that what you said earlier, our trade agreements are like children. They last as long as they last. We're in grave danger, I think, in this country of thinking that somehow people will play fair with us because we're nice as opposed to being vigilant. Thank you so much for your time and your effort. I know you don't sleep very often because we talked before. You're doing one hell of a job. Thank you. I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from California, Mr. Panetta, to inquire.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Ranking Member Brady, and of course, Ambassador Lighthizer. Thank you very much for being here. I think in the 116th, just on the Ways and Means Committee alone, you've been here 3 times within the last 2 months, and I think that says a lot about you and your commitment to working with us, and we look forward to continuing to work with you, not just on this, but of course the USMCA as well. As well as trade with China, is very important to me and my district there in California. As you know well, California is the #1 ag-producing state in the nation, although I appreciate the questions from my other members here on the dais. California is what it's about when it comes to agriculture, and the Central Coast of California being the salad bowl of the world is what it's about when it comes to being agriculture, and it contributes to that title that we are the #1 ag-producing state. But obviously, these retaliatory tariffs have affected our farmers. You have over 800 food and agricultural products that are being taxed, and unfortunately, a lot of those products can be obtained from other non-U.S. trading partners. And so what we are seeing is the closing of certain markets. Now, I appreciate the fact that there is an aid package and of $12 billion, and I actually spoke with some of my almond growers yesterday who were benefiting from that. But I can tell you, and what we've heard and what you've heard, I'm sure, it's not about aid, it's about trade. And it's not about short-term bailouts, it's about long-term business. And so my question to you is, in regards to these markets that are potentially being shut off, that are being closed, what are we doing to recoup those markets in regards to your negotiations with China?
Well, thank you, Congressman. First of all, the problem on retaliatory tariffs and market opening goes beyond China. I should say that. And one of the things we're doing is we're having negotiations in a variety of areas. We're at a bit of a stalemate with Europe right now because they won't include agriculture. We want to include. We have our talks with Japan, which have a very big agriculture component. We have USMCA and the 232, and I'm looking forward to working with you on passing USMCA because it's so important for California and Illinois and everyone else. So I'm working for now in terms of China, which unfortunately is only part of where we've had retaliatory tariffs. If we get an agreement, those tariffs will come off, and then the president's hope is, although it's not the purpose of the negotiation, that the purchases will have the effect of not only giving short-term sales, and by the way, we're looking at numbers that go out several years. It's not like I should make this point, even within the purchases, which contrary to what's in the newspaper, is not the function, the purpose of this. Those purchases are going to have targets and amounts that go out for several years. But our hope is that if you increase those agricultural sales and you do it for a period of years, you will create new customers that will have results that go on years and years and years and years into the future. So this is it's a very real thing that the president's worried about. Obviously, when you get into a situation where you're trying to bring change about, it's going to have costs. No one has been more treated less fairly than the farmers, right? I mean, they are in a position where they should have enormous markets. I mean, in China. China's a big market for us. As I say, they're our second or third, depending on the year, market, excluding, of course, 2018. But there's a much bigger market there. I mean, there's a lot of people there, and with any kind of fair trade, farmers would be beneficiaries too.
Thank you for bringing that understanding into these negotiations. I yield back. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you. We will now revert to 1 for 1 on both sides, and with that, the chair would recognize the gentleman from New York, Mr. Reed.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. And Ambassador, it's always great to be with you. And I really do echo what my colleagues have said about you. I think you're the right person at the right time to take on this much-needed negotiation with China. One of the things I want to bring to your attention and maybe your thoughts on, as well as my colleagues, to focus on a little bit as we deal with these tariffs and the future after we negotiate this agreement. I do believe we're going to be able to negotiate an agreement, and you have one chance, very limited runway, to do this right, to make a fundamental shift in our trade relationship with China. But, one of the things I see, and I see the Chinese position, they're thinking long term. They're always thinking long term. They're not looking transactional. And so as I see the negotiations proceed and the tariffs that are on the books and reaction in China, I see their commitment as a co-chair of the U.S. Manufacturing Caucus to build up excess capacity. And I'll add another issue to it, excess inventory of certain products, so that when that new marketplace is created, what are we going to do to protect American markets from that excess capacity and inventory that would then be dumped or thrown into the U.S. market in a very dangerous way, in my opinion. Do you understand what I'm getting to? Because as I see manufacturers, as I see folks, especially in advanced manufacturing, I see China reacting to this transaction of what we're dealing with these negotiations. But as these tariffs come off, as we operate under this new agreement, how are we going to minimize the adverse potential impact of what the Chinese 2025 long-term vision of positioning them as a world leader in manufacturing to protect our manufacturing bases here in domestic soil?
I mean, thank you for that question, Congressman. That's a fundamental question. I want to make one point clearly, and that is, I think the United States has been guilty of short-term thinking and short-term view for sure, but I don't think that's true of President Trump. President Trump, that's why he's going after structural changes. He is looking down the road. He's thinking, he wants to know what's going on way down the road and have the United States still have this advantage. We have to be number one. We just have to stay number one. And by the way, most people in the world want us to be number one, right? I mean,
I totally agree with you. So what are you going to do when that valve is potentially opened up? Are there going to be strict enforcement mechanisms?
So you have to have strict enforcement. Let's remember, no matter what happens, we have to maintain strong laws against unfair trade. We have to remain strong anti-dumping laws, strong countervailing-duty laws.
So if that inventory is dumped on the U.S. market, what are we going to do to make sure that that enforcement is there and easily executable by us to take on that Chinese action?
So, number one, we have in here provisions, if it's agreed to, that will limit subsidies specifically in cases of so-called competitive industries. That is to say, where there is this problem of excess capacity. What you're talking about is what's happened in steel, what's happened in aluminum, what's happened in solar panels, what's happened in washing
advanced
machines.
manufacturing.
On and on. Yep. There is an agreement to limit subsidies in those kinds of cases. There are unfair trade laws, and then there's the enforcement provisions in here. This is a pattern, and by the way, it's not always even a plan. Sometimes it's just they start this, and the provincial governments and the local governments all kind of get into it, and they don't have a way even to put their own brakes on, right?
Well, so do we at least agree that that potential threat is there, that I'm raising?
I absolutely think it's there. It's undeniable that it's there.
And we want to put enforcement mechanisms readily available to us as partners in this agreement that we can then deploy against China. We may need to make it very clear, I think, to China that we're ready to use those. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
Thank you.
Absolutely.
That I yield back.
Thank you, gentlemen. Let me recognize the gentlelady from Florida, Ms. Murphy.
询答中间呢，就是问到了，说这个你怎么样能够确保中国会遵守和美国定的这个协议？当然，大家知道这个谈判还在进行当中，很多细节也不便透露。就算是要告诉议员呢，恐怕也是要等到这个闭门的会议。那么这个议员就问到了，就是说这个美国和中国这个中间的这些纷争啊，或者贸易纠纷呢，牵涉到很多基本价值观的问题。那么现在这个在谈判，大家都很注意、很关切。那么当然希望这个谈判呢，能够确保这个美国呢不要再继续被中国以不公平的方式来获取各样的利益。那么你究竟怎么样能够确保谈出来的结果真的就是如你所说的？这个莱特希泽讲的还是一些原则性的东西，但是也提到几个非常重要的观点。他这个原则呢，就是川普总统他是看得很远，他知道你不是说单靠中国增加购买或者是定某些计划，你就可以改变中国现在的行为模式，这做不到的。所以川普总统讲得非常清楚，就是美国和中国定的这一个协议是能够确实达到效果的。怎么达到效果呢？莱特希泽因为现在还在讨论嘛，所以还在谈判嘛，所以细节不能讲这么多。但是他提到的一个就是说，最要紧的就是美国确切的在这个协议中间要写下条款。什么条款呢？就是在北京方面，从中央到地方都必须切实执行美国和中国达成这个贸易协议。那么这个是说它的所有的这个细节如何使得这一个条款是一个可以执行的，是一个有效的规范双方的。他说在这个条款中间会定下在这个协议中间会定下这个条款，那就且让我们拭目以待了。好了，这个是刚才的这个询答中间的一些重点，我们再继续看这个现场这个议员现在的这个提问。
His workers' jobs, my constituents' jobs at risk. And unlike his bigger competitors, David doesn't always have ways to mitigate the harm. So if this 10% tariff endures, the damage could be really severe. And if it increases to 25%, the damage could be fatal. In 40 years as a business owner, he tells me he's never seen government actions interfere so directly with his businesses. And I know you're not insensitive to this issue, but what do I tell these small business owners like David, whose livelihoods are on the line? When is this going to end? What will their sacrifices have allowed you to achieve? And do you think you're going to be willing to accept a deal that falls short of what you've indicated you wanted to achieve in order to end this trade war?
So, first of all, we are sympathetic to situations like David's, although I don't purport to know the details of it. But there clearly are people who import products who are negatively affected. I would suggest that this is a 10% tariff, and that with the depreciation of the Chinese currency, it's probably having a 4 or 5%, maybe less, maybe 2 or 3% effect on his business. So I just would make that statement. In terms of notice, of course, you know that we go through a notice and comment process. This process of putting these tariffs in place was months going through with hearings and all the. So I don't want to let anybody have the impression that this is something that just we woke up and did this. No, there are laws and we followed them, and there were months and months and months and months and months of process going through here. I always start with the proposition of, do you think we have a problem with China? If you don't think we have one, then all of this is crazy. If you think we have a problem with China, then we have to weigh what is necessary to move forward. And in terms of what we're willing to accept, no, I don't think we should accept anything that doesn't have structural changes and is enforceable. Absolutely not.
Thank you, and I yield back.
Thank the gentlelady. With that, let me recognize the gentleman from South Carolina, Mr. Rice, to inquire.
Ambassador Lighthizer, thank you so much for being here. I have told you repeatedly that one of the things that gives me the greatest confidence in this administration is people like you and Secretary Ross that have taken on these jobs to lift up American workers. Heartened by your observation about the loss of the 5 million jobs since China entered the WTO, and your objective in taking this job and doing something about that and lifting up our middle class. Because you see, I believe that our middle class, that American workers can compete with anybody in the world on a level playing field, and that we here in Washington have allowed that playing field to be tilted against them for far too long. Beginning around 1990, we were competitive at that time in the world, but we sat on our hands and allowed everybody else to change their economic systems, including their tax system, regulatory structure, trade policies, and so forth, to take advantage of American workers. And 30 years ago, we could accept trade agreements that weren't necessarily in our favor. We were so far ahead of the rest of the world, but we can't do that anymore. So I'm really proud of what the President's done, restructuring our tax code, restructuring our regulatory system, and I think the next most important thing we can do is to balance our trade agreements. Your progress on NAFTA is so important and so impressive. Your progress with China gives us great hope, although I heard you say at least a dozen times today that it's not done yet. But I just want to applaud you on how far we've come, because I don't think there's anything more important at this point, after tax reform, after regulatory reform, that we can use to make our economy competitive and allow our workers to compete on a level playing field. Once we get through this, we need to move on to infrastructure. I want to tell you that I had a town hall in Loris, South Carolina last week, and a group of farmers came to my little town hall in Loris, and they're worried. They grow peanuts and tobacco and cotton and soybeans primarily, and they said to me, you know, we're worried about this disruption with China. It's certainly affecting our business. What can we expect? When can we expect? You know, how quickly is it going to be resolved? And we talked about all that, and I promised them that I would raise these issues to you here in this hearing. So they're watching you right now. Hello, everybody back home. But that being said, when we got through, they also asked me to tell you that they're behind you, and they're rooting for this president, and they recognize that this has to be done, and they recognize how important it is. So in my last minute, I'm going to turn it over to you, and I am going to ask you to tell my farmers back home as best you can what they can expect.
Well, you know, thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your comments about me. I'm grateful for that. I would just make the obvious statement, and that is that, like other members in my position, people in my position, we are inspired by and empowered entirely by the President. If it wasn't for the President, I'd have no power and no inspiration. So I'm happy to have this opportunity to be able to at least fight for the things that we all care about. And so we'll see how that turns out. I would say to these farmers, I think that they have been victims as much as anybody in America, what goes on in China. And I think they have they are more vulnerable than a lot of other people for a whole variety of reasons that we all know about. And that if we have an agreement, there's a likelihood that we'll begin the process of the payoff. Once again, if we don't enforce and we don't keep on it, it's not going to happen. Fortunately, we're not in a world where just good things happen automatically, right? So if we do our job and if we get an agreement, I think there's going to be a good payoff for them. And the president is very grateful for their support. He understands exactly that these are real people putting it on the line for him. So thank you.
We thank the gentleman. And with that, let me recognize the gentleman from Nevada. Inquire, Mr. Horsford.
也是从农产大州来的。从农产大州来的，首先关切的就是农民的权益有没有受损，尤其是在相互的中美之间的贸易战呢，那么对于农民来讲，确实是受到的伤害很大。那么莱特希泽也特别讲，他说，美国的农民已经成为美中贸易战中间的牺牲者，而且牺牲之大是其他所有的行业所不及的。这就说明了，这个莱特希泽在和中国谈判的时候，很显然的对于有关于这个农产品销售的，或者是不但要确保，而且要增加农产品呢销售出口到中国，这是一个重点工作。那么这个议员讲，他说我现在在咨询你的问题，我家乡的父老透过直播在看，我们一定要问这个问题，你怎么样做到这些事情？当然，这个在和谈判这个正在进行当中，很多事情呢是不好讲那么具体的。但是这个莱特希泽就充分的他说，我表示我们注意到这个事情，这也是我们正在和中国谈判的这个问题。那么他谈到的就是说这个真正说是这个贸易战的这个问题能够解决啊，那么最要紧的不是说你答应什么事情，而是说你答应的事情你能够做到，这个才会使得贸易战呢告一段落。这个是美国现在坚持的原则。好了，这个现在你看连续几位议员呢，都是从这个农产大州来的，像刚才问的。它是这个美国那个肉类的一个非常重要的产地。从南卡罗来纳州的议员就问到了有关于这个农产、有关于农民所承担的这个风险，甚至已经造成的损害。好，我们现在这个再继续看其他的议员的这询答。
And since last March, the administration embarked on a series of tariff actions that drew retaliation from trading partners. And I know that, Mr. Ambassador, you have talked about the need to focus on enforcement and structural changes as part of this process. But what hope and relief can we give to our constituents about some of these pressing impacts that we see right now based on this ongoing trade war with China?
Well, thank you, Congressman. I would say, first of all, in these circumstances, one has to begin the analysis, as I said a minute ago, why is there a problem, right? And if you believe there is a problem where we are right now between the United States and China, and that problem threatens our future and our kids' future and all of those people who we are very concerned about and who are adversely affected, if you don't believe those people are potentially very seriously affected unless we change policies there, then there's no point in this. But if you do think those people's futures are threatened, then you have to go through this process. And our objective has been to try to minimize the effect. As the Congress lady said, we have to minimize our effect on our own consumers and maximize the effect on others, and we try to go through that process. But when we get out the other end, we have to be in a position where we have actually defended our workers and our farmers and our ranchers, and we have the potential for structural change in China. And I think we've done a reasonably good job of minimizing that effect on our own consumers. That isn't to say that individuals aren't particularly affected substantially, and we have an exclusion process to try to help that out. So we're sympathetic and focused on it. In terms of the steel, I would just say generally, I want to get a steel agreement. The president wants me to get some kind of a steel agreement if I can with Canada and Mexico. I think that'll alleviate some of that problem. And
thank you very much, Mr. Ambassador. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I yield.
Thank the gentleman. And with that, let me recognize the gentlelady from Alabama, Ms. Sewell, to inquire.
Last but not least, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also want to thank you, Mr. Ambassador, for being here today. This discussion is long overdue. In fact, since the last time you publicly appeared before the Ways and Means Committee, this administration has imposed a 25% tariff on $50 billion of imports from China and another 10% tariff on $200 billion of Chinese imports. The Chinese predictably retaliated with a tariff of $100 billion on U.S. exports. We are all aware of China's unfair trade practices, and you're right. The fundamental question is not just, do we believe there's a problem with China and trading? We do. I think universally all of us will agree with that. I think the more fundamental question is, what do we do about it? I think that it's important that we do something about it, but I can also tell you that the tariffs have had a really devastating effect on the folks back home in Alabama. In fact, I have three concerns about the 301 tariffs as enforcement mechanisms. First, it is a go-it-alone strategy that I am concerned about that this administration is taking, when I really think that we could have put to use our alliances and created multilateral pressure on China and probably been a little bit more effective quicker. Secondly, while we in Alabama do believe that trade works for us, we really believe that retaliatory tariffs don't. And the retaliation that has the most impact on my district has been both with farmers as well as with my manufacturers. According to a Brookings study, Birmingham, Alabama has the 5th highest exposure to retaliatory tariffs in the country. Since the trade war with China has begun, Alabama exports have faced over $254 million in retaliatory tariffs. And moreover, my cotton and soybean growers' supply chains have been dramatically affected. The longer the tariffs are in place, the more likely it is that a lot of this shifts in the supply chain will become more permanent, causing more concerns by lots of my constituents. In fact, the forest industry in my district is suffering from a 25% tariff on southern pine logs and a 10% tariff on the softwood lumber. So I guess my question really is one of a fundamental belief that while there is definitely a problem, a trade problem with China, is the enforceability of tariffs, the way we're doing them, the best way to get at that problem? So my question is, especially given the fact that we're looking for Section 301 tariffs as a tool to enforce other trade agreements, my question to you really is, do you see Section 301 tariffs as an enforcement tool of last resort when all of our options have been exhausted, or do you see it as a weapon that can be deployed regularly to exert concessions from other economic rivals and allies?
Well, I would say, first of all, I don't want to conflate tariffs with other tariffs, right? Because, I mean, as you know well, there's the softwood lumber, that's a litigation matter brought by private people. The steel and aluminum is something entirely different, in my opinion. I think 301 is an effective tool. I think we should be working with members to find more effective tools. And I can, at some point, I want to sit down and take you through the history of 301 sometime when you're just like ready to go to sleep and you can't get to sleep. I'll take you through it and go, because it's kind of an
Since I sit on the Intel committee too, many sleepless nights for me.
I guess that's right. So there's a history there. I think we need better tools. But in terms of whether or not we should have done what we did or did a multilateral approach, I honestly believe that good people tried for 20 years the multilateral approach and the talk approach and the let's all go along, get along approach. And I can tell you, at some point I'll show you, I brought along, I have a chart here that sort of shows the trade deficit with every one of these go along and get along. There it is right there. So here's the trade deficit, and here's every one of these go along joint things. They just demonstrably failed. And when you're in a situation where something really, really matters in our kids' lives, jobs depend on it, and you've tried something and it's failed for 20 years, you'd have to be crazy, in my judgment, not to try something else. Now, is this perfect? I'm not going to say it's perfect, but it at least is leading to results where everything else didn't.
Now, I just want to say thank you for allowing the ambassador to complete his answer. And I just really want to just say in closing, we're all really, your success is our success. We do want to get a better balance when it comes to trade with China. And I want to thank you for being open enough to come and talk to us on a regular basis with respect to these tariffs and the trade agreements.
We thank the gentlelady, and we will conclude with the gentleman from Georgia, Mr. Ferguson.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Ambassador, thank you so much for being here today. It's been fascinating sitting here and listening to both sides.
应该现在这个国会的这场听证会已经是逐渐接近尾声了。刚才的这个女议员Sowell， 她以为她是最后一位，结果现在后面还有一位。那么这个在刚才这个询答中间呢，是谈到一些原则的问题。那么莱特希泽就是跟这个议员呢强调说，我们现在和中国这个谈判呢，是牵涉到了一个长久的利益，牵涉到了我们下一代他们的就业机会，牵涉到了美国未来几十年的发展。所以呢，这个美国所追求的就是要和中国的正常的贸易关系。所以呢，这个议员呢提到了这个，例如这个301条款等等，虽然是1974年的，那是40多年前的，但今天呢依然是美国和其他国家的正常贸易的时候必须遵守的准则。所以呢，这个议员提到这个，然后这个莱特希泽也是强调，他说这个我们现在要做的事情呢，就是要有一个长远的规划，所以不是说短期之内你买多少产品美国就觉得可以了，不是这样子，而是在一些这个基本的结构上的问题，在一些做法上能不能够公平的问题，这个是美国现在和中国在贸易对话的时候所坚持的。你看今天这个听证会从头到尾这个话已经重复了，出现了好多次，也说明了美国在这件事情上的坚持和着重。好了，我们这个看这个下面这位议员，听到这个议员他谈到了有关朝鲜、有关于日本的问题，我们看他怎么说的。
Develop these trade deals so that we can collectively work to change the Chinese behavior.
Well, thank you very much, Congressman, and thank you for your comments about the president's program, which I think is working, and I'm certainly going to pass along to him the various comments people have made about what we're trying to do. But you are right, and I said this at one point, and I'll say it again. There is no trade program in the United States if we don't pass USMCA. There just isn't one. What it says is that we don't have a consensus and that we don't want to stand up for our workers and our farmers and our ranchers. I think there's no less than that at stake. We have an agreement. It's clearly better than its predecessor. There's no question. It's $1.3 trillion worth of business. Millions and millions of people are affected, and it just has to pass. If it doesn't, you have no credibility at all with China, and you will have no credibility on any deals with your other trading partners. I have members come to me as I tell you, every day I talk to 2 or 3 members, just literally every day. And they're all, it's always constructive and this, and they have ideas and they have thoughts and all this, and I always in the back of my head think, if we don't pass USMCA, just don't bother. Just sit down and just say, we'll just wait a few years before we say anything.
I want to thank you for that and addressing that, but I want to switch gears for just a minute. In my hometown, we have an automaker there, Kia Motors manufacturer in Georgia. We have seen the benefits of having a good trade agreement with South Korea. We want to continue to see that. One concern that I have, and if you could address it very quickly, the timelines both on the USMCA and potentially any trade deal, 3 to 5 years for implementation. Talk about how that to me seems like a relatively tight timeline. Is there opportunity, if companies are moving in the right direction, to give some leeway as they try to bring jobs back to America? Could you hit?
USMCA requires a very short transition. They can get the additional 2 years if they are meeting certain requirements. We've worked with the manufacturers. Is it a tight time frame? Yes. Is it a doable time frame? Yes. We have to make changes as soon as we can. by extending this out, I mean, we have consensus among manufacturers, and by extending it out, you're just postponing new Americans getting their new jobs, and I don't want to do that. We want these people to be employed as soon as possible. So this is a doable thing, and by the way, we want them to be manufacturing more engines and more transmissions in Georgia, and I think they're going to, and they're going to quit using the Korean engines and transmissions to a large extent. So this is going to be a big win for you, but I don't want to defend them. I already pushed it off as far as I'm going to push it off. Who knows where I'm going to be in 5 years?
Thank you, Mr. Ambassador, and thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank the gentleman. Mr. Ambassador, let me thank you for joining us today. As always, your accessibility is appreciated by the committee.
各位我们的推友，在这个美国众议院的这个商业委员会啊，今天所进行的这个听证会啊，到此应该是告一段落了。主要呢就是来听有关于美中贸易谈判的相关的事情。那么最后这个议员问的都是和这个美国的这个美墨加的一个这个自由贸易协定啊的一些相关的议题，跟这个中国的关系比较少。那么在今天整个这个历时差不多是超过3个小时，这里边呢可以听得出来，那就是美国现在和中国所谈判的，但美国必须是要强调是一个可以执行的，是一个可以这个有效的实施的，而且是从中央到地方啊，都必须要能够确切的要遵守的，这个美国才会和中国达成这样的一个协议。那么在这个协议中间呢，定了很多条款，是有关于细节如何确保它能够实施的。另外呢，就是这个协议里边还包含了美中这个以后的贸易对话。那么这个司处长级的每个月要见一次面，然后副部长级的每一季要见一次面，然后部长级的每半年要见一次面。也就是说，这个要有直接的沟通，要有高层的沟通，要有持续不断的沟通，来讨论美中之间的贸易议题。那么这个莱特希泽在回答了这个几十个问题里边呢，谈到了很多现在和中国之间的这个贸易谈判的重点，也谈到了一些这个美国所强调的理念。其中很重要的一个字眼，他用的就是一个正常关系，就是美国和中国现在这个中间的这个经贸的问题问题出在哪里呢？出在美国所遭遇的是一个不公平的对待，所以呢，这个是贸易谈判的时候美国必须要强调的观点。而且呢，美国现在要求的中国是一个长久的结构性的改变，而且呢，美国要求的是这个包含这个服务业美国也是这个要求这个中国是要这个开放大门的，也就是说这是一个对等的。还有一个呢，就是美国要和中国建立起这个贸易纠纷的调解机制，不必说旷日费时的提请到世界贸易组织去裁决了。还有呢，就是美国这个和这个中国之间这个对话，美国一再强调的是，美国要确保这些规章是不是有效的执行，因为在美国看来，如果是一个公平的这样的一个贸易关系的话，那美国所目前拥有的这种科技优势，在全世界是首强的这个科技优势就可以继续维系下去。这个呢，对这个给今天这个议员呢，这个说明了美国现在和中国的贸易谈判的一些这个细节吧。好了，我们今天的直播也就到这里告一段落，谢谢您的收看收听，我们下次再会。